All for coming. Can you all hear me adequately in the back? Cool. Yeah, so this is, as you know, because we're here, the Psychedelic State. We're going to be talking about some of the recent research that's been happening in psychedelic compounds. LSD, DMT, and psilocybin are going to be the focus. We'll break down a bit of the research on that. First, I'll give you an overview of the intention for the course overall. I sort of have this structured in a developing progression. So what we're talking about today is just an overview of the psychedelic state and what sorts of qualities that means for the experience when you're using psychedelics and how that can be useful, why that can be useful. In the second week, we're going to be talking about mystical experiences specifically. An interesting consequence that's come out of the research into psychedelics is that the occurrence of a complete mystical experience is predictive of lasting personality changes and the positive outcomes of therapy. Though there's some contention in that. In some of the more recent stuff that's come out on, for example, using psilocybin to treat alcohol use disorder. And one of the reasons I think that is because of an inadequate way of defining mystical experiences. There's usually an emphasis put on like oneness and connection to some sort of divine principle. Usually it's kind of a contentless experience of one or another overwhelming emotion and oneness with some object or oneself. But there's also lots of cool things to be said about how visionary content becomes presented to you in these experiences. And so I think that'll be interesting to flesh out because it'll really help to give you some practical information on how to optimally engage with the psychedelic state. So the third week we're going to talk about microdosing. We're going to cover some methods and some of the theoretical reasons related to some ways of framing cognitive science and neuroscience as to how microdosing works and what you might want to be using it for, how you might want to be using it when. In the last week, we're going to talk about wisdom and psychedelics. An interesting fact about psychedelics is that they're often associated with traditions of magic or wisdom. Ayahuasca, of course, is used by the shaman character in a lot of indigenous societies in South America, and even in ancient Greece, we have Plato being initiated into the Eleusinian mystery cult, which was using a substance called kykeon, which it's expected had some variation of ergot in it, which is what LSD is derived from. And yes, these experiences of transcendence, of vision, like divine visions, they're always associated with the development and culmination of wisdom. And an important thing to look at is how we can develop wisdom from psychedelics. An interesting thing we'll cover is that the same things that are involved in wisdom actually are also the same things that are involved in being foolish. It's the same sort of like cognitive processes, and it's all about sort of timing them appropriately. And if those become mistimed and miscoordinated, then you can just as easily lead yourself to folly. So sort of the double-edged sword of using these kinds of things is that you can get an acquaintance with a sensation of absolute truth, but is that actually coordinated with what is true in the world? Not always. And yeah, so I've also sent everyone out a package of references for the seminar as well. If you just bought tickets today, give us your email and we can send that out to you. I provided a bunch of open access research articles that I'll be drawing on in this seminar, as well as a little review package that I made for your reference. There's some resources in there with, for example, personality tests that you can take to sort of determine what your temperament will be like going into the psychedelic experience. And yeah, disclaimer as well, I'm presenting a lot of this information knowing that a lot of people who are here are very much interested in engaging with these experiences themselves. So, while we don't condone the pursuit or purchasing of illicit substances, from a harm reduction perspective, people are going to be doing this anyways, and so one of the most effective ways of reducing the harms of especially psychedelic compounds is knowing exactly what they are and what they do. The archetypal bad trip kind of happens when you take something that you're unaware of, in a place you're unaware of, with a bunch of people who are not really ready to be supportive for you. And yeah, those are very easy risks to mitigate. And so that's sort of an aim of this seminar series overall. So there are two main categories of psychedelic compounds. We have tryptamines and phenethylamines. The tryptamines are based on the usually serotonin system, which is comprised of tryptophan. It's like a precursor that gets turned into serotonin in the brain. And phenethylamines, we're not going to talk too much about. They have a slightly different structure. I'm not much of a chemist, I'm more of a cognitive scientist, neuroscientist. So we're going to be focusing more on that level of analysis, but so you have it, those are the categories. We're going to be sticking mostly with the tryptamine psychedelics here, especially psilocybin and LSD. DMT there hasn't been too much research on yet, and a lot of the recent research that has happened is using psilocybin. LSD got a bit of a bad rep in the 60s and 70s with theory, so it's a little easier to get people to fund grants for psilocybin. All right, so for those of you that are interested, these are the chemical structures. You can see that they all share sort of that similar bond at the very leftmost corner of it. And they interact with primarily the serotonergic system. So the history of psychedelic research in the West is pretty long, actually. People usually focus on the 1960s and 70s and then what's going on today, but they were actually brought into science by this fellow here, Louis Lewin, who started studying the peyote cactus in 1894. And then shortly thereafter, Arthur Heffter, after whom we get the Heffter Research Foundation named, he synthesized and identified mescaline as the psychoactive compound of the peyote cactus. And since then it's been used widely in psychiatry, not so much anymore, but that was like one of the primary compounds used for the initial days of psychedelic research. And if you've read The Doors of Perception, that was mescaline that Aldous Huxley was describing his experience about. So I'm going to run over some early theories on psychedelics. Interestingly, a lot of these elements still come up in modern research. So one of the first names for these compounds was psychotomimetic, meaning that they mimic the symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia. And one of the first uses for mescaline and LSD was actually for psychiatrists to gain empathy and insight into the condition of their patients. So rather than using it to treat others, a lot of the time they were using it to gain insight into the experiences of people that they were working with as a compassionate, empathetic tool. But the question remained once it started being applied to addiction research and to people who had anxiety related to terminal cancer diagnoses. How is it that something that produces symptoms that are kind of like our notions of insanity, how does that promote healing as well? So another common theory was the reducing valve theory. So this is based on a view of the brain which was proposed by the philosopher Henry Bergson. And what it says is just that the brain acts to constrain and filter experience, that there's just an overwhelming amount of information available to us, and you know, if we had access to all of that, we wouldn't really be able to meaningfully interact with the world because we'd just be overwhelmed. And so the brain constricts and constrains experience, selects out things for relevance, and passes on into our conscious awareness a very minimal version of what's actually out there in the world. And what psychedelics are doing is they're turning off this reducing valve and allowing a much greater degree of information to pass up into your conscious experience. We then also have the psychoanalytic theory, you know, the late 19th, early 20th century. That was heyday for Freud, Jung, and the other psychoanalysts. So, of course, there's a lot of research from that period with these theories in mind. This is the classic view of the structure of the mind according to Freud. So, you know, you have unconscious processes, a very minimal amount of conscious processes. These are sort of broken up into what's called primary and secondary process. So your unconscious stuff that you don't really have control or access to, that's your primary process. And you get that emerging in dreams, in experiences of creativity, and also you get an unconstrained dominance of primary process thinking in psychosis and things like that, so the theory goes. Secondary thinking is the stuff that's happening up at the level of consciousness, conscious awareness, and that's characterized by more rational, analytical modes of thinking. And so the theory was that psychedelics are sort of reducing the constraints of secondary consciousness and allowing for an emergence of primary process thinking. All right, so what is in a name? There's been a lot of names that have been proposed for psychedelics. As we talked about, the first one widely used was psychoanalytic, followed by hallucinogen, meaning to produce hallucinations. A problem that people have had with that from the beginning, though, is that they don't really produce genuine hallucinations. The definition of hallucination means that you need to actually think that the thing that you are seeing out in the world is an object of truth. But your reality checking is generally intact when under the influence of psychedelics. And so they're not really hallucinations in that technical sense. And so that prompted people to explore other, more accurate names for these compounds. One that's still commonly used today is entheogen. So that means to generate the divine within. This refers to the tendency for these compounds to produce mystical type experiences and for their use in religious traditions. For example, the Santo Daime Church, which is spread internationally, would prefer this kind of terminology. I have a personal problem with that term, though, because I think it sort of creates a value judgment on like one end of all possible mystical experiences. So I also like to use this as a balancing term, entheogen, replacing theos in the middle, which means God, with dio, which comes from daimon, meaning demon in Greek, because psychedelic compounds can really reveal a lot of darkness, and this is darkness that must be contended with. But I think if we're going to be using a term like entheogen, we shouldn't really ignore those sort of darker aspects of our unconscious that we have to be working with. So another term I found interesting that I saw in a talk I listened to from the Psychedelic Science Conference was aneirogen, referring to using psychedelics to generate dreams. So if you take these substances before you go to sleep, you can have like really vivid dreams. Another term used in the early research in the 50s was psychoanalytic, meaning mind releasing. So that also referred to a specific way of using psychedelics in therapy, which is at much smaller doses so that you can sort of like still have your linguistic functions intact and be engaging in a therapeutic session with somebody. Usually at higher doses, you're just sort of having an internal experience, blindfold, going into yourself and allowing your own unconscious processes to occur. But in the context of psychoanalytic therapy, smaller doses within the context of talk-based therapy. And interestingly, I don't really see people talk about this too much, but you can also use psychedelics as nootropics, which is basically what you're doing when you're microdosing. Everyone's trying to enhance the capacity for creative thought, for insight, that kind of thing, and to kind of enhance their neural machinery. So I think that's a legitimate way of talking about these things. One of the early names proposed as an alternative to hallucinogen was phenerothine, and then psychedelic, which came from this correspondence between Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond. Humphrey Osmond was a researcher working out of Manitoba. He was the one who provided Aldous Huxley with the mescaline with which he wrote The Doors of Perception. And he also makes an appearance in that book as well, because he was Aldous's trip sitter for that experience. So they had an exchange in which these two poems were used to propose alternative names for what was currently then just called hallucinogens and psychoanalytics. So on the side of Aldous Huxley, we have, to make this mundane world sublime, take half a gram of phenerothine. That word meaning to show spirit. Osmond replies with, to fathom hell or soar angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic. And so that comes from the roots psyche and delos, which are Greek, meaning mind and manifest. So basically what they're getting at is that they are just substances that manifest the mind, which I think is the most accurate way to be looking at these things, because as we'll see, there are as many psychedelic experiences as there are people. So what are psychedelics useful for? Well, so far, we have been using them to treat depression, especially treatment-resistant depression, and end-of-life anxiety in people who have terminal cancer diagnoses, addiction for both alcohol and tobacco. There's one small study on obsessive-compulsive disorder, though I would recommend if you have obsessive-compulsive disorder, maybe try not to self-medicate with that, because OCD is often an attempt to regulate anxiety by implementing control over your environment. And you might not respond very well if those structures of control begin to be dissolved. I've heard of some experiences from people who have OCD and have tried new psychedelics, and it's a very anxiety-provoking experience having those structures of order be dissolved. So trauma also is something that psychedelics are useful for, though MDMA is the one that's been getting most renowned for being able to treat that. Using psilocybin and LSD hasn't really been used recently to be treating trauma, but I think that is going to be a really interesting use for these things. One of the main reasons being the way that trauma manifests is by impairments in mental imagery. You get very intrusive memories that are causing you a lot of trouble, and memory flashbacks and that kind of thing. That's all incorporating your memory systems and your mental imagery systems, and psychedelics really work by modulating your mental imagery, so it's kind of targeting the faculty at which trauma is working. Now, some other general uses that we have are creativity, promoting general well-being, wisdom, as I mentioned, general spiritual and philosophical exploration, as well as education. There's a writer, his name is Ken Tupper. He has a bunch of good papers that I would highly recommend on the subject of using psychedelics as tools for education, predominantly because of their capacity to promote feelings of wonder and awe, which are good for developing intrinsic motivation for pursuing the subjects of further education.
So Ken...
Oh, Ken Tupper. Yeah, Tupper. And yeah, one thing that hasn't been talked about recently, but was looked at in the between the 50s and 70s, was using LSD and psilocybin to treat mood disorders. There was a recent meta-analysis that was analyzing those papers that were published between 1949 and 1973. They found that 79% of patients showed clinically judged improvements post-treatment for a variety of different mood disorders. So that's something that hasn't really come up yet, but is worth noting. One of the problems with that early research, though, is that they didn't really have the same strict guidelines and procedures that we do now. So they would blind their studies, for example. It was all open label. Everyone knew what they were taking, what they were doing, which increases the likelihood of a placebo effect. So that's a common criticism lodged against that early research, but still interesting and definitely worth looking into nonetheless. All right, so getting into the psychedelic experience. Now there's a massive array of subjective effects that you can get from psychedelics. So this was taken from a recent paper which created a visual scale of the 2013 study, one of the initial brain imaging studies with psilocybin, and this was taken from people's self-reports of what the experience is like. So these are kind of like the baseline effects of what occurs in the psychedelic experience. We're going to try to account for how this variety of experience happens as a result of the neurochemical action of psychedelics. So I won't comment on that too much. This is just to give you a overview kind of where we're going with this. This one is a visual of LSD research. So you can see it shows the differences between 75, 100, and 200 micrograms of LSD. This graph here is developed from the 5 dimensions of altered states of consciousness scale, which sort of breaks into these 3 clusters of oceanic boundlessness. It's kind of your feeling of like being at one with the world and floating, that kind of thing. Anxious ego dissolution, which you can see, interestingly, there isn't too much of that going on in LSD. As we'll figure out shortly, LSD doesn't actually promote ego dissolution as readily as psilocybin does. And then we have the dimension of visionary restructuralization, which is one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm excited to get there. We'll talk about sort of what elementary and complex imagery means as a part of this seminar this week and next week. So I think the fundamental question is, are psychedelics an experience or a state? So these are two quotes that I selected from some recent papers. This first one here is from the treatment of alcohol use disorder with psilocybin. So the authors say, ultimately, psilocybin-assisted treatment appears to elicit experiences that are extremely variable, yet seem to meet the particular needs of the individual. So again, referring to the mind-manifesting quality of these compounds, they somehow manage to show you what you need at the time you need. Which is interesting, like how does a drug do that? And from another paper on analyzing network dynamics in the brain, the authors say more rapidly changing cortical dynamics with increased flexibility may potentially underlie the enhanced sensitivity of the environment and context observed under the influence of LSD. So we've all heard that set and setting are the primary recommendations for people using psychedelics. We'll talk a little bit about why exactly that is the case, but basically you can really radically change the sort of experience that you have just by putting yourself in a different environment, surrounding yourself by different people, surrounding yourself by different things. So psychedelics are arguably a state of consciousness from which you can access other worlds, as opposed to any set of regular experiences. So what exactly is a state of consciousness then? So at least for the purpose of this seminar, I'm providing the following definition. A state of consciousness is the neurocognitive parameters that determine the quality of conscious experience, what it's like to be in that state, and the scope of information and alternative states available from those parameters. So as an example, we can look at the normal waking state of consciousness. These are just a few arbitrarily selected parameters for reference. So your episodic memory access is relatively unimpaired. If you're having a conversation with somebody, you can remember what you need to at the time. You can also access a number of different states from that state. So the flow state, when you're really engaged in a task that's meaningful to you. You could go to sleep, you could enter a meditative state, you could have an insight, you can daydream, and the constraints that you have on thought and inference are both rationality and logical thought, as well as creative thinking and analogical thought, metaphor, that kind of thing, which we can contrast to the depressed waking state. So depression would then be a different state of consciousness, very inhibited access to especially episodic memory. The mood state constrains you to memories that unfortunately reinforce the depressed state. So that's characteristic about the kind of information that's available from that state. And you have a constraint on the possible states accessible from that state. So you can fall asleep easily, you can daydream, you can ruminate, but it's much more difficult to have insights, to enter genuine meditative states, for example. To enter flow experiences is also difficult. And you're much more constrained to the thinking type that accords with rationality and logic, and creative analogical thought is made a little bit more difficult in that state as well. So the way that I kind of like to look at this is like this. And one day I would really love to make a map of all of the possible states of consciousness that kind of looks like that. So we can take this, this is from a video game called Fez, which I would highly recommend as well. It's great. And so we can look at that blue one in the middle as being sort of like the normal waking state, and then each of these other shapes here are different places you can go from that state. So for example, perhaps the one to the immediate left of that is a meditative state from which you can go to the several jhanas of Buddhism, which are different states of the experience of nothingness. And then perhaps culminating in the mystical experience down there, but you have to take this very specific and linear route to navigate the waking conscious state. And there's, as you can see, many more states available in the psychedelic state. So this could be a visual representation of that. Because of the loosened parameters of the psychedelic state, you have access to much more possible states of consciousness from the initial conditions of the psychedelic state. And so how is that happening? We're going to go in this order. We're going to talk first about chemical action very briefly. We're going to talk about ego and ego death, connectedness and feelings of connectedness, the general changes in brain dynamics. As a result of that, we're going to talk a little bit about a cool paper that is using or relating psychedelics to artificial intelligence. We'll talk a little bit of visual perception, elementary hallucinations, cognitive effects, emotional effects, the effects of psychedelics and music, and some of the personality-related factors that can predict certain outcomes of psychedelic state. Okay, so chemical action. Psilocybin and LSD, which will be our main targets of study here, but there's evidence that like DMT and the other tryptamine psychedelics do operate on largely the same mechanisms, mainly they have different affinities to different receptors, so they're kind of targeting the same things, but at different strengths. We have two main pathways of action via the serotonin system and the dopamine system. So we're going to talk really only about the 5-HT2A receptor. Though an interesting thing about LSD is that it seems that the first half of the LSD experience is mediated predominantly by the serotonergic system, whereas there's more of an emphasis placed on the dopaminergic system in the latter half of the LSD state. So that's sort of just been noted in the research. There hasn't really been anything sort of pulling out the consequences of what that difference means yet. So our main receptor of interest, though, is the 5-HT2A receptor, because this is responsible for the psychedelic qualities of tryptamines, such as the perceptual distortions that you get, the feelings of elevated significance and personal relevance. The 5-HT2A receptors are also involved in mediating lots of like your top-down processes. So there's like the distinction between bottom-up and top-down processing, where anything that you are having an effect on in your own cognition is kind of like coming from higher areas of the brain. Anything that's sort of like an automatic impulse or drive is coming up from your bottom-up system. And the 5-HT2A receptor systems are also involved in mediating plasticity in the brain as well. And we'll flesh out a bunch of these things in more detail as we go along. But an interesting thing is that if you block that receptor, there's a chemical called ketanserin, which blocks the 5-HT2A receptor, and that actually eliminates basically entirely the psychedelic effects that people really associate with psychedelic experience. So you don't have any of the perceptual effects, you don't really have any of the attributions of like meaning and significance and truth that you get with psychedelics, though there are some things that are left intact, such as impairments in working memory, which seems to be mediated by the 5-HT1 receptor, which we'll come back to, I think today and also in week 3. So just as your reference, these are the average doses that are used in the studies. So psilocybin, they use about 15 to 40 milligrams per kilogram. It's obviously a synthetic version that is only psilocybin, and it's usually injected. And that kind of averages about 3 to 4 dried grams of mushrooms, so that's really rough. So don't use that as a guide. Mushrooms have variable amounts of psilocybin in them. So keep that in mind. But as a reference for you who may know what that's like, that's how people are having experiences in the research. LSD is 75 to 200 micrograms. DMT is usually about 0.04 to 0.4 milligrams per kilogram. And that one has a really high affinity for those 5-HT2 receptors, because that small amount can lead you to jumping out into alternate dimensions and interacting with aliens in space. Okay, so ego dissolution. Also, I want to also make a note, which I forgot to make at the beginning, that we're going to be here for a while, so after about like an hour and 15 minutes or so, we'll break and then come back. So these are some quotes from a few overviews of psychedelic research that kind of describe the experience of ego dissolution. So subtle effects are described as softening of ego with increased insight into one's own habitual patterns of thought, behavior, personal problems, and past experiences. There are more drastic ego effects, known as complete ego dissolution. They're described as the dissolution of the sense of self, the loss of boundaries between self and work. And then so these are some of the things they use to get people to rate on a scale of like 1 to 7, or a visual scale, how like that. These are used as measures of the quality of ego dissolution. I felt like I was merging with my surroundings. All notions of self and identity dissolved. I lost all sense of ego. I experienced the loss of separation from the environment. I felt at one with the universe. Psilocybin is found to produce ego dissolution more reliably. subjects who experienced complete ego dissolution in psychedelic-assisted therapy were more likely to evidence positive clinical outcomes, as well as long-term changes in life outlook and personality trait openness. So that's interesting. And we're going to flesh out exactly why that's the case. So firstly, what is the brain? Well, the brain is a set of interacting networks. There's two main views in neuroscience that we can compare. One of them is called the modularity thesis, which proposes that there are discrete modules that process certain kinds of information. So for example, you have like one area in your visual cortex that processes only only straight lines. There's an area in your brain that only coordinates your movement. There's an area of your brain that only processes sound. And a common thing that comes with that is the notion of information encapsulation, meaning that each of these modules can't process information from other modules. So that view of the brain is wrong. The way the brain actually works is according to a principle of neural reuse. Plasticity is the primary thing of importance in the brain. The whole brain is sort of arranged in the way that it is, just because over the process of development, like your whole head and your sensory systems are really not too differently laid out. So as you develop, the brain sort of falls into similar kinds of functional specialization, but that doesn't really mean that those are functionally differentiated in the way that the modularity information encapsulation view says. So for example, there was a study in the late 80s at MIT, and they rewired the auditory visual cortex of ferret brains. And so they basically got the neurons in the visual cortex to process sound, and they got the neurons in the auditory cortex to process vision. So the brain is massively plastic, and that's important for the psychedelic experience because, for example, what I'm going to talk about the function of hallucinations and visionary content is that you're basically getting like your visual cortex to process abstract ideas. Cool, yes, I've done some stuff through that. So there's a number of regular networks that develop in the brain, for example, the default mode network, which is of particular interest to people in psychedelic research. This network is referred to as the ego, at least by Robin Carhart-Harris and his affiliates. It does all sorts of things that the ego is said to do, taking yourself as an object, making sense of yourself as different from the world. It's involved in projecting ideas about yourself into the future and reflecting on your past. So really anything involved in making sense of yourself as a particular individual engages this network, but it's also active at rest. It's one of 11 resting state networks in the brain. So when you're not doing anything, you're just sitting around and nothing's happening. There's a bunch of resting systems that sort of maintain a preparedness for processing information in the world. There's one involved in salience, picking up things that are spontaneously occurring in the environment that might be significant to you. There's a visual state resting network and also this default mode network. And the primary nodes of the default mode network, which are being shown here, are at the front of the brain, the medial prefrontal cortex. That large one at the back of the brain is the posterior cingulate cortex. These are sort of like the integrating hubs for your neural systems. And there's also key nodes in the angular gyrus, also called the left inferior parietal lobe, in this second picture to the right. And those are involved, those are really close to your like motor and memory systems. So there's a difference also, interestingly, between functional connectivity and structural connectivity. So functional connectivity is when there's an actual electrical connection between a set of neurons. Structural connectivity happens as a function of plasticity when, after rehearsing these pathways long enough, they actually become structurally represented in your brain. You can actually then see them physically. So this default mode network is more or less absent structurally in children. If you image the brains of children that are about 8 to 10, they have very low structural connectivity of this network, but they have just as much functional connectivity as adults do. So as you develop up into your mid-20s, which is when this network sort of begins instantiating itself in your brain, at the time you're in your mid-20s, there has been enough rehearsal of the networks involved in this that they become structurally represented, which are sort of like these information highways that form as a result of plasticity. One of the catchphrases of neuroscience is cells that fire together, wire together. So as these fire together more and more, they become more and more connected physically in the brain to lower the burden on finding those pathways again. So an interesting consequence about that, though, is that in conditions like depression, the default mode network is very overactive. It kind of dominates your processing, and you have a very difficult time breaking out of it, which is why you have constraints on things like creative thinking and insight. Insight especially requires breaking out of this network and then reformulating again back into that network with a new way of constellating information. And so you don't really get that capacity to break out of that network because as you're going through the process of rumination and thinking about yourself negatively, that's rehearsing and reinforcing this network in your brain, and it kind of entrenches itself and becomes very difficult to break out of it, dominates your processing. Whereas in normal function, you have a very even trade-off between these resting state networks and what are called task-positive networks. So as the name suggests, task-positive networks are active when you're focused on any task out in the world. And so the brain usually trades off between moments of synchrony and disorder. You have discrete networks forming that will then break out into sort of chaotic arrangements that cascade across the brain, and then will snap into a new state of order and then back out into disorder. And that trade-off process happens as you're going about your day-to-day experience. The networks being formed that are required for the tasks that you're working with. So that is basically inhibited and impaired, and the default mode network kind of becomes like a general purpose machine that attempts to do all things in not only depression, but also in anxiety, and there's also normal functioning of that network in trauma as well. And what is interesting is that there are a very high concentration of those 5-HT2A neurons within each of these connecting hubs of the default mode network. Psychedelics, when you're taking them, basically kind of like sit into this network and dissolve its function. It basically frees you from the constraints of this normal system of ordering that you learn over the process of your development. And it allows you to break out of that, to explore more novel states in the brain that you can then take with you into your waking experience. Of fundamental importance too is it basically just allows your brain to rehearse the function of breaking out of that network in general. So it allows you to access pathways out of those networks, which are usually not as accessible if you are, for example, ruminating consistently and reinforcing this network over periods of years, causing those nodes to wire together very tightly and prevent you from breaking out of them. Psychedelics allow you sort of a way to develop pathways out of that dominant system of processing. And this is a quote from, I'm pretty sure this was the first neuroimaging study on psilocybin done out of the Imperial College of London. And so we see again that early view coming back here of the reducing valve. So the quote goes, "These results may have implication beyond explaining how psilocybin works in the brain. By implying that the default mode network is crucial for the maintenance of cognitive integration and constraint under normal conditions. The finding is consistent with Aldous Huxley's reducing valve metaphor and Carl Friston's free energy principle, which proposed that the mind-brain works to constrain its experience of the world." So the psychedelic state is a very unconstrained state, allowing you to visit many novel spaces in the brain, some that you may never be able to otherwise. So Carhart Harris and a few others who are involved in that neuroimaging research wrote a paper called the entropic brain hypothesis. In this, they do talk about the default mode network basically as the functional equivalent of what we consider the ego to be. And they propose a continuum of primary consciousness to secondary consciousness, which sort of mimics also the notion in the psychoanalytic theories of primary versus secondary processes. This maps effectively onto that, such that this more or less replaces exactly that kind of view, where secondary consciousness is relatively more constrained. It's more characteristic of normal waking consciousness and more analytical, rational ways of thinking. whereas primary consciousness is associated with, for example, the psychedelic state, infant consciousness, which hasn't yet learned or developed those networks, REM sleep, early psychosis, divergent thinking, creativity, and an interesting consequence about that, you'll notice here where it says criticality proper. I'm going to flesh out what that means. It's very significant for what's occurring in the psychedelic state. It's making reference to the notion of self-organizing criticality. So, as I mentioned, the brain sort of trades off between states of like synchrony and disorder. And in those periods of disorder, there becomes a point of instability where order sort of spontaneously forms. So there's nothing really in the brain that's like doing this order. A common thing in the cognitive science literature is the homuncular fallacy, which means the view that there is like a little man inside your brain doing everything, right? There's like a little man who is like doing the processing of seeing, directing your actions. It sort of like passes the buck for explanation at an analysis, a level of analysis somewhat deeper into the neural tissues. But yeah, a lot of the, especially research in psychology, doesn't really work too hard to get rid of that fallacy, and it kind of seems as though there are sort of like little whole individuals in the modules of your brain processing information. But what's really going on is that it's all self-organizing. So there's nothing really doing it, but it is somehow a thing done. And it's done according to that principle it's been studied in physics called self-organizing criticality. There's a physicist by the name of Kerbach who did research on this by using sand piles. So it's very simple research. And so if you have a platform on which you have a pile of sand and you're dropping sand onto it at a very thin stream, what happens is that the sand pile will build up slowly. But once it reaches a certain point, the sand will start to cascade around it, and it will become very disorganized. The base can only support its development so high, and so you'll get instability building up in the base and the structure of the sand pile, and what will happen eventually is that the base will slide out, providing a space of greater order from which a taller sand pile can grow. And that period of instability where the sand starts to move about and cascade around in a somewhat random fashion is that period of self-organizing criticality where either the system as a whole can collapse or it will spontaneously reorganize itself into a new state of order. And so your brain kind of capitalizes on that general principle of physics where it spins itself into a state of order that from which there can be the spontaneous reformulation of a new state of order. And
what is collapse?
Sorry?
And what is collapse?
I think like the unitive mystical experience could kind of be seen as that, where you're completely incapacitated and you're having an experience of transcendent nothingness. I think that's when there's like absolutely no order and your brain is kind of like randomly reaching out amongst its networks. That's not very stable. It will eventually constrain itself into a new state of order because of the fact of structural connectivity. There's a bunch of like physically represented networks in your brain that kind of prevent you from going into absolute collapse. Yeah, so that would kind of prevent that from happening, but there are temporary cases of that happening, such as the mystical experience, where you're kind of incapacitated and experiencing more or less what you would say is nothingness. Also death. Yeah, any questions about that? I kind of ran through a bunch of stuff quickly.
What was the term of the physics term?
Self-organizing criticality. Yeah.
What about mania? Would that be on the high entropy end, or would that be?
Yeah, I don't know about that actually, because you could kind of like, if you take like a lot of stimulants, you could get something that's similar to mania.
But that's overactive downs.
I think actually it might be something, and I'm just thinking of this now, so I'm kind of making this up as I go, but mania might be something like a flow state where what's happening in the flow state is you're kind of like getting immediate constraints on like emergent disorder. So it's kind of like on the brink of self-organizing criticality, but there's like a structure being brought to it immediately. Yeah, so kind of like have that happening continuously. And so it would kind of be like a flow experience on just like everything. Any other questions? Cool. Okay. All right, good. Oh yeah, so basically what psychedelics do is they kind of push you back into primary consciousness where you're much closer to that phase where self-criticality can occur, and that's by increasing the disorder in your neural system. It dissolves those higher order networks that are keeping your cognition relatively constrained, pushing you to a space where new systems of order can spontaneously formulate within the experience. And so an interesting thing is that that push back into primary consciousness and that dissolution of the ego is related to feelings of connectedness. One of the reasons I think that that is because that default mode network, which is constraining your thinking, is making sense of yourself as something different, a different object from the world. And so when you're getting that network being dissolved, it's sort of there's a bleed-in of your network systems that are making sense of self and world, and they're both sort of like mutually integrating, sort of breaking down that distinction between self and world, allowing you to break outside of your sense of self as an individuated object, and feeling more at one with others in your environment and the environment itself. So it's been found that connectedness to nature, even specifically, but also connectedness to society and connectedness to yourself, are increased after psilocybin use, which correlates precisely with the extent of past psychedelic drug use, so the amount of times you dissolve that network, and the intensity of ego dissolution as well. So you can see there's a graph there which shows you the relationship between well-being and social connectedness. So the authors in the 2017 study on treating treatment-resistant depression with psilocybin took measures of people's reports of well-being as well as their reports of feeling connected to their social networks. And in proportion to how much well-being increased, social connectedness also increased. There, that shows you the sort of relationship between those things. Again, just articulating the same thing. With an increase in connectedness, there's an increase in well-being. And so some other research that is interesting about that is, so this comes from the University of Toronto, and this paper called Chronic Social Isolation Reduces 5-HT2 Neuronal Activity. The rest of it, we don't need to talk about too much, that's just how that's happening. But what these researchers did is they put rats in conditions of social isolation, and they compared that to a control group of rats just hanging out with their friends and family, as per usual. Unfortunately, they killed them all and sliced the brains open to find out how many receptors are on each of the neurons in certain parts of the brain. And what they found is that the 5-HT2 neurons are markedly reduced in the brains of rats that experience social isolation. Normal functioning in socially connected rats, but lower excitability of 5-HT serotonin neurons as a result of a reduction in the amount of 5-HT2A receptors that you have in the brains of those socially isolated rats. So then we can compare that to this other paper, Serotonin and Brain Function, A Tale of Two Receptors. Here's a quote from that. Serotonin 2A receptor signals mediate rapid plasticity conducive to major change in outlook and or behavior when such a change feels necessary in aiding physical or psychological survival. The function may be related to the unique capacity for humans to adapt to a variety of physical and social environments. So through this research in psychedelics, these authors found that the serotonin 2A system seems to be responsible for mediating plasticity, especially self-mediated plasticity in the brain. So in conditions of isolation, which is very common in depression, for example, even if you're not actually isolated, you feel very isolated, and that feel of isolation seems to be related to a reduction of those 5-HT2 neurons, and thereby an impairment in your capacity to adaptively modulate your own neural systems. So yeah, it's kind of unfortunate because really traps you into learned modes of thinking and learned modes of being. But the benefit then of psychedelics is that they vastly increase the excitability of those 5-HT2 systems, and they sort of restore your capacity to adaptively regulate your own neural systems and to create change in your brain.
I had a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering how that relates to our cultural or societal understanding of creative or imaginative people as being socially isolated as well. Because that perception still exists, but this seems to contradict that in some sense.
Yeah, I think that's a stereotype. I don't think it's a very real one, because if you look at artists, they're often very socially connected and partying all the time. There are cases where that could happen. Of course, you have like the stereotype of the mad genius. That person might have something a little bit closer to psychosis. There are actually similar genetic markers involved in highly creative people and in schizophrenia. So people who are like more towards that spectrum of schizophrenia might have more difficulty in maintaining social relationships as a result of the markedly unconstrained style of their thinking. So I think there's like a minimal population for which that's true, but it's because of that sort of genetic similarity between creativity and things like schizophrenia, as opposed to the sort of social connectedness thing. So that would be like the kind of person that would be true for, perhaps. Okay, so we talked a lot about brain dynamics, especially the default mode network and the relative amount of order versus disorder that occurs in the psychedelic state. Here are a few other network differences that are involved. You get, interestingly, an overall decrease in cortical blood flow. So that was kind of paradoxical to the researchers who were doing the initial studies, to find that you actually get less metabolism in the brain under the influence of psychedelics. Now, an interfering factor with that might be that psilocybin, which both of those studies referenced are using, is a little bit vasoconstrictive, meaning it constricts your veins. So that could be accounting for a little bit of that effect. You get increased connectivity between the thalamus and the cortex. The thalamus is like right in the center of your brain. Its main function is as like a routing hub for sensory information. So like visual and auditory information gets kind of directed to the right areas of the brain for processing that via the thalamus. And the amount that the thalamus is connected to certain areas of the cortex is actually predictive of the vividness of different hallucinatory content that you get within that. So it seems that there's like sort of an overflow of emergent bottom-up activity that's being passed up into the cortex to kind of make sense of as visuals or auditory stimulus. Now, there are a few specific areas where you do get increased cortical blood flow, increased processing. For example, the early visual area, V1, it's at the back of your head. We'll outline a little bit more of that in the next slide or so. But especially with LSD, you have a very high resting state activity in those early visual processing areas. And you also get an increase in cortical blood flow specifically to the right frontal and temporal lobes, as measured at least with psilocybin. And that will have some interesting consequences that we'll talk about in the next 2 weeks, because that area kind of mediates both mystical experiences and insight. There is a picture that has disappeared from my slide. But I have another one which will show you the same idea. So, these pictures are also gone. Okay, I will find them shortly. We'll take a break pretty soon. Anyways, what it's illustrating is this principle here. So, connectome harmonic decomposition of brain activity reveals dynamical repertoire reorganization under LSD. It's quite a mouthful. This study did a meta-analysis of a bunch of the LSD neuroimaging studies. What they found was that you get an expansion of repertoire of active functional connectivity network states. So that's sort of iterating the thing we talked about. earlier with that entropic brain theory, you have a greater access to more possible networks that can contribute to your cognitive functioning. Now, as that's usually been talked about up until the publication of this paper, is that it kind of randomizes the activity of your brain, but it doesn't. It is a non-random reorganization, and it follows something called power law scaling, which is another term used in physics. The definition is a relationship between two quantities such that one is proportional to the fixed power of the other. So they're measuring the differences in, there's like different frequency bands in the brain, so there's like the alpha frequency and like the beta frequency, the gamma frequency, and all of these are like involved in processing different kinds of things. We don't need to go into that too specifically, just the abstract principle itself is important, that the amount to which you get a reduction or increase in, say, the alpha frequency band, you also get a proportional increase or decrease in all of the other frequency bands that are occurring, and that phenomenon of power law scaling indicates systems that are prone to self-organization. So that finding just gives us more evidence towards the fact that we're getting pushed into a state where there's enough entropy or disorder in the brain that novel states can emerge and contribute to cognitive processing. Now this last point here is interesting, because this is kind of one of the things that mediates the sensitivity to set and setting. So there's an increase in energy and strength of the network states. The authors define strength as the duration of activation. So when you have a network forming in your brain under the influence of LSD or psilocybin, it's actually active for a longer period of time. And another thing is that the energy is how much that particular network contributes to overall brain dynamics. So what that means is that any one functional connectivity network can have the effect of creating a massive neural avalanche of other sorts of networks formulating after it. So the way that that would look, for example, is that say I'm in my living room at home and I have like a picture of my mom and I took some LSD, or actually before taking LSD I just look at it and I get like a feeling of familiarity, and I maybe get like some memories about when that picture was taken, and so my memory systems are interacting with that sense of familiarity and facial recognition. 7 hours into the LSD trip I look at this picture of my mom again, and it reminds me of like 10 things that I experienced with her across my experiences growing up, and then I see her emerge from the picture and she embraces me and turns into a bunch of flowers that then spill off into an ocean which then consumes me, and that's basically what that's happening. Very small things can create these massive cascades of activity. And yes, the pictures that I was going to show here show you that while they're, because of that decreased blood flow, we mentioned a few slides earlier, there's actually lower overall activity in the brain, but higher connectivity. So there's more things connected at any one given time, and for longer periods of time. And you'll get occasional periods where there is like lots of random firing happening, but usually things are, interestingly, very stable looking. So there's like lots of connection, but not as much activity as in the normal waking state, but a lot of things being connected. And over the break, I will find some pictures to illustrate the images from the neuroscientific studies. Cool, so I think we'll take a break here because it seems to have limited my pictures for this point on. It's been about an hour, 10 minutes, so I think that's good. Let's come back in, say, 15 minutes, so 7:30, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask those now, but we'll have one question at the end as well.
I have a question. You're talking about back registration and testing for the show that it's psilocybin is on that.
Yep.
Is there any of the same tests done on LSD, and do you know of any link between vascular registration and LSD?
I don't think, not from what I've seen. I haven't seen that mentioned for LSD. I have an intuition that it might do something similar, because there are like those same serotonin neurons kind of like spread throughout the whole body. There's actually a lot of them in your stomach, which is interesting, and which is one of the reasons you get like stomach discomfort sometimes in the onset of a psychedelic experience, because you're getting a lot of those 5-HT2A neurons stimulated in your stomach. So if you want to deal with that specifically, if you just like put your attention fully into your stomach, that will allow your cognition to realize it's not nausea, and that it's just like random emergent activity. As far as what that means for vasoconstriction, I'm not 100% sure. Cool. But yeah, if there's no other pressing questions, let me just figure out this picture thing. Take a break to the washroom if you need. The washrooms are on the exact opposite side of this building here. So if you go around either of the corners, you'll get to a place where there are two doors that open to bridges. Across the bridge, that will get you back. This is one of the images. This is a visual representation of the relative connectivity between brain areas. So each of the dots on the periphery of this circle, each refers to a functional area of the brain, and the left is the normal waking state. You have a bunch of things networked, talking to each other, but as you can see, there's a massive amount of more cross-integration and network talk in the psilocybin psychedelic state. This is from the psilocybin research. So the left is with placebo neural imaging, and the right is the connectivity of your brain after infusion of psilocybin. And so this is another picture of your brain on drugs. The top, there's placebo. The red is showing connectivity, not necessarily like movement or activity, but just which networks are active at the time of the imaging. And so, yeah, you can see there's much more cross-network talk. There's lots of things being rooted to places that don't often have communication. This one is with LSD, in a 2016 study. This image is from the 2012 psilocybin study that I had the quote about the reducing valve. This is also an image from that same study, and what it's showing is that the highlighted areas have decreased cortical blood flow. Now, something that I'm going to flesh out a little bit in the next week is why this might be the case. A lot of your serotonergic neurons, especially in the higher cortex, are inhibitory. So while the 5-HT2A neurons are getting excited, their function is to inhibit other things. And there was another kind of colloquialism from neuroscience, which I read in a book about psychedelics, and I've never heard this term, but apparently it's something that neuroscience like to say. One neuron's excitation is another neuron's inhibition. So perhaps what's going on is that even though you're getting an excitation of a particular kind of neuron, their function is to suppress activity in other areas of the brain. And yeah, we'll talk a bit more about the consequences of that next week, but that could be responsible for the reduced blood flow. And interestingly, also seems to be in line with that sort of reducing valve theory, where inhibition of certain networks is sort of reducing the constraints that are normally applied to your experience. So psychedelics and artificial intelligence. I love this study. It is fascinating. So I'm just going to run over this quickly. So neural networks are a system of computation that are modeled after the brain. They have a system of interacting networks, usually at minimum composed of 3 layers. One where you input information, a hidden layer that processes and integrates the nodes between the layers, and an output layer, which generates your answers. Neural networks are used for things like image recognition. So Google is currently working on a bunch of drone analysis software, and that's using neural networks. They're training it on images to be able to discriminate between different kinds of stimulus. Facial recognition is a very common thing that uses this kind of processing, and there's another example of how those systems work. You just have like different nodes connected via a number of different pathways, and then as you present this network with, say, a bunch of faces, it will learn a pattern of activation that produces a correct response. So kind of like your brain learns those resting state networks across your development. As these networks develop, they too will wire together when they fire together, and then the program is basically that particular way of the networks connecting. So there was a paper published in 2014 called Neural Coordination Can Be Enhanced by an Occasional Interruption of Normal Firing Patterns, a self-optimizing spiking neural network model. And what the authors of this study did was they built a neural network. The specific kind is called a Hopfield network. They specifically tried to make it as biologically plausible as possible, meaning they tried to model it to work something like the default mode network in the brain. And they basically developed kind of like a psychedelic algorithm, or at least that's what I like to call it, where they took a network that had learned a space of activity, and those are called attractors, and an attractor is like a normal space that will attract activity, and that's kind of like the default mode network in the brain. That also can be called an attractor, and after it learns this attractor space, which can have the problem of falling into what's called like a local minima, where it kind of can solve the problems that are being presented to it well, but it reaches the threshold where it can't learn to solve the problem any better than it already has. It kind of gets stuck in this attractor, and you can't really break out of it, even though there are more optimal ways for the program to work. And what they did was they took this network that had learned an attractor, and they reset it from a bunch of random initial conditions. And what this allowed the network to do is, and I quote from the paper, learn more about its overall activity space and to be able to settle into a novel configuration which more optimally solves the problems that were presented to the network. And so in that paper, they had a section where they're mentioning that the ritual alteration of consciousness used in shamanism and other sort of like magical mystical traditions, especially with the use of like psychedelics, and they cite the papers by Robert Conrad Harris showing that psilocybin does do this sort of like network reorganization. That the same sort of thing that's making these neural networks function more optimally in computer systems is perhaps analogously happening in the brain with your neural network systems. So it's kind of cool because that kind of gives evidence towards what's happening in the brain. We can take the same abstract principles and model them in computers and they make them work better. All right, so we'll talk about perception and mental imagery effects. So in the research on mental imagery, psychedelics, hallucinations in general, they break that up into two different categories. There's elementary hallucinations and complex hallucinations. Complex hallucinations we'll talk about next week. Those are like when you're actually having sort of imagery either closed-eyed or with your eye open that kind of has a narrative quality that seems as though it's actually something in the world. Elementary hallucinations are things like seeing geometric patterns. This is a quote I took from a review paper on psychedelics, and they're citing the information they're getting this from. They say the visual field can become permeated with intricate tapestries of brightly colored flowing latticework and other geometric visual-spatial form constants. And so form constants are, let's go to those first, hold on. There. These are the form constants identified in 1928 by a researcher named Kluver. He was doing research with psychedelic and noticed that there's like four main categories of closed-eye visuals that people are seeing. You get like tunnels, spirals, lattices, webs. This seems to be pretty common across people's experience. Yes?
I guess for a psychedelic experience, would it make more sense to say illusion instead of hallucination? Because hallucination is the creation of an object in the environment, while illusion is more what you're looking at gets distorted.
Yes, definitely. So the terming of elementary and complex hallucination, like the complex ones are more kind of what hallucinations are like, but that's just sort of a pragmatic choice of term for using like different measures. It's like a categorization tool, but I think most researchers would agree with that.
Well, I think like fundamentally what you said earlier is that it's hallucinations are defined by you believe that's there. So like if you see these patterns and you believe that they're there, that's a hallucination. And that makes me wonder like how much of that is just the fact that you knew that you took a psychedelic? Like if you were seeing those things and you hadn't taken a psychedelic, would you be more likely to believe that that's real and then it would be categorized as a hallucination?
That's a good point. That is possible in some experiences. I think the problem with psychedelic research is that it's really difficult to create like blinds where you don't know what you're giving them.
Yeah.
Because that's usually
unless you're in the CIA.
Unless you're, well, yeah, but then you, I mean, the point here being that you definitely know when you're not. Like, you know something's up.
Yeah.
So there is a certain kind of psychedelic that does also generate genuine hallucinations, like Datura, for example, is something that breaks down your reality testing. That also acts more on like your acetylcholine system, which is involved in like motor coordination and I think it's also involved in like integration of sensory experience in the thalamus. So that compound is using a chemical more specifically involved in mediating actual perceptual integration, whereas the serotonergic system is not. That serotonergic system is involved in the creation of like mental imagery and dreams. So there's a very different quality, and I think that even if you didn't know you were doing a psychedelic, you'd be able to kind of tell that like something is a little bit up, because it's using the system of mental imagery and dreams as opposed to like actual sensory integration.
Just off of that, an anecdotal experience I had was a friend of mine ate a chocolate that he wasn't aware that there was some psilocybin in, and I remember he lived with me, and he was lying there like, seemed really unwell, seemed sick. He was like, I don't know what's wrong with me, there's something wrong with me. He disappeared upstairs for a couple of hours, and then he finally came back down like 2 hours later, and he's like, I know what's wrong. There was psilocybin in that fucking chocolate I ate earlier. Like, you know? But it took him a couple hours to realize what was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
And only contextually, because he knew who gave him the chocolate, and he was like, oh, I'll bet I know what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the context is probably important. There's also exception cases as well. For example, I had an experience once where like, my friend's face turned into overspace. And that was really real. So exceptions do happen.
Yeah.
The context probably helps.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this kind of like fleshes out a little bit more what people are studying in the category of elementary hallucinations. So it is like intensification of perceptual experiences, things are like brighter, there's distortions, illusions, mental imagery, intensification of color saturation, text redefinition, contours, light intensity. So you're basically getting like clearer and exaggerated versions of perceptual stimulus. The external world is often experienced as if in higher resolution, seeming more real than real. I will cover this in a second, actually. I just want to finish up the point about like those form constants, because there's a really interesting thing about why those might be occurring. So here's a depiction of your visual cortex. You can see it's spread out into a number of different areas which are kind of functionally specialized. Your early visual processing area is kind of like nested right between some of your higher order visual areas, like that light blue color. That's doing a lot of your basic early processing of things coming into your brain from the external world. And then as it passes up this hierarchy, the processing becomes more and more complex. So like, for example, the part labeled MTV5 is doing motor perception, or motion perception, and color perception. Starts in the retina, but is stabilized in areas 3 and 4. And a cool thing about this, there's a thing called the retinotopic map, which occurs in these early visual areas. So the top is sort of a map of the eye with like a fovea in the center, and then each of these points is numbered to correspond to a place on the visual cortex where when information hits you at that particular part of the eye, it is laid out in order on the corresponding areas of the primary cortex. And a really interesting thing about this is that, like, using this kind of research, we can do like brain reading in the fMRI to tell like where you're looking and even what you're looking at. Even within like dreams, there's been like some basic research being done on like being able to interpret the images in people's dreams. And the reason that is because you can actually like, you have like a map of your visual field laid out of your visual cortex. And this is the area where you're getting an increase in resting state activity. So when you're not looking at anything with psilocybin and LSD, this area becomes much more active. There's like lots of spontaneous activity forming across that. And then, as we talked about with that principle of self-organization, that increase in activity and that increase in disorder will spontaneously result in the formation of ordered sequences of firing. So it'll kind of like stabilize, producing on this retina map patterns that look like this. So it could be the case that when you're seeing these closed-eye patterns, you're actually getting self-organizing electrical stability patterns that are like cascading across your early visual area that are superimposing into your vision. So you're kind of literally seeing the patterns of electrical activity and self-organizing across your brain, superimposing into your vision.
Question.
Yes?
Does it, like when you see a certain pattern, have they done research to find if it like is related to a certain kind of thought, or like how it's organizing, the way that it's organizing?
Yeah, so this one, there's a paper by, his name is Thomas Froese and a few others, but I can't remember their names. And it's called Turing Instabilities. That's the beginning of it. It's like electrical instability and self-organization in nature. And so they argue that it's just a fact of the spatial constraints of the organization of your neural system in the visual cortex. So it's not really related to any thought, it's just that because of the spatial constraints of your brain, it's self-organizing into these patterns, which are also called Turing instabilities. Those same kind of pattern organization behaviors are also responsible for the spontaneous emergence of like dog patterns on like leopards and other animals as well. So you're getting the same sort of abstract dynamics resulting in patterns on like animal skin as they grow as are happening in like the spatial organization of the brain. Yeah, I can upload that paper to the package that I have made for everybody. It's just like a Google Doc, but yeah, they talk a little bit about like the math involved in that, and also how that quality might have given rise to like the early cave paintings, which have similar patterns to these. So they also, kind of go a little bit stone ape theory and say, maybe because of like altered states of consciousness, and this is just how electrical activity, when it becomes particularly disordered in the visual cortex, emerges. People were just kind of translating this fact of neural organization that superimposes into vision into like their cave paintings. But there is more to be said about like how this can scaffold different kinds of thinking, which we'll talk about when we talk about visionary mystical experiences next week. Because this initial state of disorder in the early visual cortex gives you lots of information, lots of activity that really hasn't been made too much sense of, that can contribute to being pulled into mental imagery, to make mental imagery more vivid and real. Yeah, which might not make sense now, but it will. Yeah, so just run over some of the mental imagery effects that have been found. Psychedelic mental imagery can be modulated by both verbal and musical auditory stimuli. Synesthesia has been reported, especially in visual phenomena driven by auditory stimuli, so sounds influence the things I thought. Somatosensory perceptions can be drastically altered, such as feeling unusual body sensations, including body image, size, shape, and location, which, probably just from your normal systems of ordering that stuff kind of falling apart. So cognitive effects. So it's been found in 2 studies from the early 2000s that there is reduced performance on standard measures of working memory and directed attention. So it's much harder to hold objects in your mind to like willfully work with. The capacity of working memory is usually said to be like 5 plus minus 2. So you can say hold like 5 different numbers in your head at one time, but that becomes more difficult to do when you're under the influence of psychedelics. However, an interesting thing that's been shown from a different study is that in people who have more experience with LSD or psilocybin actually have a reduction in that working memory impairment. So that is interesting. Not too sure what's negative that yet, but I guess you kind of just like learn how to be in that space, and you can more readily operate it once you become more familiar with it. And yeah, one of the things that it does, which will become important when we talk about microdosing, is that psilocybin impairs your ability to filter out distracting stimuli. So it's very easy to get carried away with things because distractions are difficult to filter out. And part of the reason for that, or actually rather part of why that can be useful, is because in conditions, especially of trauma, you're doing a lot of like top-down suppression of memories, and that capacity to, in a learned way, divert different kinds of thought becomes impaired, which is why you get sort of like the emergence of like content coming into your experience, which is a thing to be cautionary of if you are using psychedelics and you have like unresolved trauma, because it'll sort of release you from those learned neural mechanisms that are diverting the stuff from your attention, and it will come up regardless of whether you or not you want it to. Yeah, which is very important to consider. That's why, like, if you're just at a party doing this for the first time, that's not good, because you do not know if maybe you need to meet some internal demons, and that can go poorly. So sense of time and causal sequence can lose linear cause-effect structure, making it difficult to track the transition between moments. And so a little more neuroscience. The part of your brain that is tracking sequences of order across time is actually the same sort of part of your brain that's tracking sequences in space. So this is, like I mentioned when we were talking about what is the brain, that neural reuse is one of the fundamental principles of the brain because of like plasticity, learned adaptation happening. So in the process of evolution, the machinery that was already in place to process sequences in space, which you'll see more clearly laid out here, have areas like in the premotor area, so it's very closely linked to your capacity to control your movement, and the sort of tops of an area called the basal ganglia, which is involved in motor coordination and balance and that kind of stuff. That same stuff lights up in fMRI when people are tracking orders in sequence for temporal sequences. So yeah, there's a general network destabilization happening, and so you get sort of where there's a relationship between like your attention, your visual attention, and that frontal part of your brain, which does the processing of both spatial order and temporal order. That sort of becomes disconnected and disrupted. So it's much more difficult to recruit that network for making sense of sequences of order across time.
How can psychedelics treat things like trauma if it can potentially make you relive that trauma, like you say?
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about that very shortly, like what the emotional effects are. So one of the things, so trauma kind of freezes a response in your brain and in your nervous system. You have like a response to a very challenging situation that you didn't really get to play out. And so your brain creates markers on that, and in extreme cases of trauma, you get intrusive memories of that stuff anyways, so you don't really have a choice. Very small things can trigger the reliving of that anyways. But what happens with the parameters of the psychedelic space is that it biases you towards positive emotions, and it also, because of pushing you into that higher disorder state where self-organizing criticality can happen, can more readily produce novel structures of order that can help you to integrate and make sense of those memories. So an important fact of like trauma treatment is that you do kind of just have to relive that, or there's a thing called somatic experiencing therapy. And what they basically do is they guide people through their traumatic memories, and along with those traumatic memories, people will make different postures and they'll have different ways of carrying their body that are related to those responses to the trauma that they didn't have a chance to play out, they didn't have a chance to finish. And so they'll integrate walking people through mental imagery experiences of that memory, and also getting them to sort of play out those unfinished responses in their body. And that will help them to more effectively integrate the trauma. And so something like that is also happening in the psychedelic experience. So an important consequence of that is that if you do get like the inclination for like spontaneous motion or movement, you should attend to that as meaningful information from your body, because your body processes memories and information actually more accurately than your cognition does. We've known for a very long time that like memory, explicit memory is reconstructive and it's very sensitive to change, but learned patterns in your body and ways of holding your body in response to trauma are actually very stable. So it's good to like trust those and to, when you get spontaneous inclinations for movement, carry them out, because then carrying out that movement might actually lead you to an insight of a repressed memory that you weren't been aware of. And that stuff becomes unlocked for you in the psychedelic state because you're diverting attention away from those less. As we just talked about the attention filtering kind of stuff, you don't have as much of a capacity to filter out information that you usually are. So it will begin to emerge into your consciousness, and the state of the psychedelic experience provides you with the sort of cognitive tools to more readily produce resolutions and to reorganize your experience around those traumatic memories to more effectively integrate them and to be less controllable. And yeah, so this is also an important part about that, because it actually enhances your memory access. People will often get spontaneous memory recall when they're using psychedelic compounds, and that's very useful for therapy, especially traumatic therapy, which usually people experience a blunting of their memory because those things are too overwhelming to remember. So they develop strategies which actually are represented neurally. You can see in cases of trauma, there's an interaction between the amygdala, which is involved in fear response, and the why am I blanking on this right now? The thing that does the memory.
Hippocampus.
Yeah, there we go, hippocampus. Yeah, there's like a kind of altered connectivity between the amygdala and the hippocampus, which when a memory will emerge, before it gets a chance to become conscious, there's like an automatic neural trigger that will like push the memory out of being passed up into conscious awareness. And then, so yeah, you get a removal of those kinds of things and an enhanced access to your memory, which is conducive to not only trauma treatment, but addiction treatment as well. Because with addiction, it's often found that people are relating to their memories in a kind of way that's maladaptive. They might know that they want to stop using the substance, but the way that they're reflecting on the experiences of like having that cigarette or having that drink is, oh, but like this time will be fine. I really just like need to alleviate the stress that I'm having now. So the way that they're remembering, reflecting on those experiences will dispose them to acting out that thing that they may explicitly, consciously not want to be doing anyways. So it helps you to sort of reorganize how you're relating to your memories as well. And so yeah, another interesting cognitive finding is that psilocybin improves the speed of emotional face recognition in depressed patients. Here is a graph about that. So when in cases of depression, you literally do become kind of locked into yourself, and it's harder to integrate information from the outside world. You're like, you have these built-up patterns of sense-making that are kind of driving your behavior, which is why like cognitive behavioral therapy works, because it's all about identifying those patterns and shifting how you're thinking such that you can sort of intervene in those systems of pattern sense-making. But an unfortunate consequence of this is because, like we mentioned, there is that dominance of that one default mode network, which is more apt at making sense of yourself and not really so much at making sense of information in the world beyond you. There are very real consequences, such as not being able to recognize facial emotions. It takes you a little bit longer to recognize and process the emotions of the people surrounding you, and there's also a bias towards responding more quickly to people who have negative emotions. And so after treatment with psilocybin, this was done on a population of people with treatment-resistant depression, meaning they for years had gone through a number of different treatments, medications, cognitive behavioral therapy, etc. Nothing had worked. They gave them psilocybin in the study, and after, I think it was about a week after, they had a control group who were not depressed, they were healthy and given psilocybin, and the patient group, you can see the differences here, where it's not a very large difference, like this is counting milliseconds, but so this is how long it takes people to respond to emotional faces, to identify them in cases of treatment-resistant depression, and this is how much it improves that after administration of psilocybin. Interestingly, you can see there's a small improvement in the control group as well, but not a really statistically significant improvement. And just a little bit more on the exact study. So there are, what they do is they take like one actor, a male and a female actor, and then they have a computerized system morph the facial features to display 6 different emotions, and it starts from a neutral face and slowly gravitates in towards one of each of the faces, which includes happiness, neutrality, sadness, anger, disgust, or fear. And so what the people in these studies have to do is, at the time where they can recognize the emotion as it's forming on the face, identify which one it is. And so it takes people with depression a lot longer to be able to identify people's emotions. Which you can imagine is like very empowering if you're trying to like have like empathetic interactions with like people in the community and such. It's harder to tell that people aren't perhaps out to get you as well, because you can't really identify what's being communicated by the body as readily. So emotional effects. So there's an intensification of feelings in general, increased conscious access to emotions, a broadening in the overall range of emotions felt during the drug sessions. So you get lots of euphoria, voluntary grinning, uncontrolled laughter, silliness, giddiness, playfulness, exuberance. This is probably common for people who have done mushrooms. Psychedelic drugs can also promote feelings of trust, empathy, bonding, closeness, tenderness, forgiveness, acceptance, and connectedness, which is all very useful for. So that's all very useful for therapy, of course. And so while you're getting an increased range of emotions and increased access to emotions overall, there's a bias towards these positive emotions, which I will talk about the reason for in just a minute. So negative emotions are often accompanied by a sense of losing control. So this is again why people with obsessive compulsive disorder might be very sensitive and prone to having adverse or challenging experiences, because the obsessive compulsions of trying to create structures of order in your environment are an attempt to gain control over an experience, and dismantling that control specifically leads to feelings of fear, suspicion, and paranoia, and so there's like a relationship between that sense of lost control and those negative emotions. Those are the cases where they're more likely to occur. A way that you can mitigate that is by having a completely trusted sitter. If you have somebody who you don't really thoroughly know, and you have this feeling of lost control, and you have reason to doubt their motives, that can really easily scaffold into a very awful adverse experience where you can't really trust the person that you're with anymore. Everyone's motives become suspect, you become increasingly paranoid, and it can be very, very bad if you don't have someone who is like very trusted, that even in losing your mind almost quite literally, you can rely on it. So harm reduction technique, have somebody you absolutely trust, at least the first few times you're doing psychedelics, just to be careful about how you might respond. And yeah, so another quote from some of the research papers: the majority of emotional psychedelic effects in supportive contexts are experienced as positive. Both LSD and psilocybin bias emotion towards positive responses to social and environmental stimuli. You can imagine there are times when that's not really adaptive. Sometimes you need to know, if, especially if you're in a public place on psychedelics, like who might not be your friend. Yeah, because that sort of happy-go-lucky, love-everyone attitude doesn't really pass too well in all cases. So be careful with your environment, know where you are, know the context, and be wary that you are going to be more likely to interpret things in a positive light. That doesn't actually mean that's how things are working. And yeah, so this is an interesting study. They show, so the amygdala is like a part of your brain. It's like kind of behind your temporal lobes, which are behind your temples. And there was an increased amygdala response to emotional phases after psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. So in the context of the psychedelic experience, there is the amygdala responds to emotionally salient stimulus, and there's just a greater response of that in general. So yeah, you can imagine like that can be very good, because you can then have access and insight into when to what other people are feeling. But if there are frightening individuals around who are maybe kind of angry looking, you'll also respond a little bit more sensitively to that as well. So for example, I guess I'll tell the story. The first time that I did LSD, there was a guy who lived in the basement of my friend's house who was a little bit questionable, and he decided that it would be a good idea. He had like really massive like black hair that like came out behind this, and wore a really heavy eyeliner, and he decided to wear a surgical mask and stand behind a door with a knife. And that's how you do not have people facilitate your psychedelic experience. Not a good time. We'll definitely respond very sensitively to that experience. So yeah, make sure you know who you're around. So what are emotions? I like this model of emotions. And I would say this is more of like a model for understanding emotions as opposed to being like perhaps what they are. But it's at least useful for understanding the function of emotions. And this comes from a paper by 2013. It's actually an artificial intelligence model for emotions called the Psi model. It's by some German researchers named Dormer and Gus. And the way that they modeled emotions was according to 3 parameters: resolution level, selection threshold, and activation. So I'm going to run through those and just articulate in which way psychedelics are modulating these parameters. So resolution level is defined as the breadth and width of associations. If resolution is deep and wide, there are many ideas to choose from, as information from long-term memory is more accessible. If it's short and narrow, then one has few ideas to cull from the little information that can be retrieved from long-term memory. So positive emotions are usually associated with broader memory access, whereas negative emotions are more constricted, partly because you need, in states of negative emotion, to have more of your attentional capacity looking out at the environment for threat. So that's sort of where the distribution of your processing goes, to external threat detection as opposed to sort of internal recall. Selection threshold is defined as when it's high, one is incredibly concentrated on the current motive, and other needs have little chance to become dominant. Opportunities and dangers are overlooked. If the selection threshold is low, one can easily be distracted and switch effortlessly between motives. Activation is defined as being dependent on the 3rd parameter. High activation is a result of a low competence level, meaning that there's some sort of like unmet need. That's how they're defining competence, basically. So like if you're really thirsty and you need to get a drink, then there's like low competence in the satisfaction of the procuring of that item of necessity. It's a bit of a weird way of defining it, but that's how we talk about it. The higher the general activation, the higher the selection threshold. Yeah, so recall that high selection threshold means that there's extreme concentration. So with low competence comes a high activation, which is basically just like being stimulated about something. So you could like articulate mania as being like really high activation, whereas like lethargy is very low activation. And yes, the higher the general activation, the higher the selection threshold, and the lower the resolution level of perception planning. This is especially important in dangerous situations when quick action is necessary and positive deliberation and energy conservation. So again, referencing in states of high activation, which are perhaps like stressful states, anxiety-producing states, there's lots of attention put on identifying how to solve problems that may or may not exist, but nonetheless are being looked for by the cognitive agent. And so the positive mood bias in the psychedelic state could be described as a function of these cognitive processing parameters. So the psychedelic state features high resolution. You have broadened access to memory, mental imagery, creative thinking, associations through novel network access. There's a low selection threshold because of the impaired working memory capacity and sensitivity to suggestion and or context. And there's a low activation, at least at first. Usually the onset of the psychedelic experience, kind of like especially with psilocybin, leaves you very mellow and feeling at one with the earth, that kind of thing. Though of course you can get high activation results, and that kind of changes the parameters. So if we refer back to our definition of states of consciousness from the beginning, this is like the resting state for the psychedelic state, but you're very sensitive to accessing a wider array of states of consciousness, such as if you're in a challenging experience, like a bad trip, and your activation level shoots up. There's an alteration in your selection threshold, and your high resolution level still kind of stays the same, but perhaps gets distributed more to mental imagery generation and creative sense-making of why things are terrible at that time, as opposed to your memory access. So we're getting close to the end. We're going to talk about music in the psychedelic state. And I think we have one other thing that I'm going to run by, and then I'm going to give you some implications about all of this for effectively using psychedelics. Yeah.
Just quickly, the model of emotion that you were using, who came up with that work? Could I read more about that?
Yeah, so the authors are Dorner and Gus. So I'll just run back to that slide.
Sorry, I must have missed it.
Yeah, so,
okay, sure.
and yeah, that paper is freely available online. I don't think they've published anything since, but that paper is pretty cool. They modeled mice in an AI system and sort of like give mice different problems and see if they respond as like mice do in the real world based on like the emotional conditions, like stress from like removing food, that kind of thing. And yeah, by their account, they did successfully create models of like how mice generally respond. Okay, so music. All of this is very interesting because like basically if you want to have like a good psychedelic experience, just use really effective music. Emotional effects can be modulated by all types of external stimuli, especially music. Well, in the package that I'm preparing for next week, there is a playlist made by the researchers at Johns Hopkins University that they play for people in the psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety treatments, and that is available online. So I've got a link in there for that particular playlist, which is shown by research to be really good. So the emotional effects can be modulated by all types of external stimuli, especially music. This will be an interesting thing to talk a little bit more about next week. Music increases connection between the parahippocampal area and the visual cortex as measured with LSD. So the parahippocampal area is involved in generating imagery about memories that you're having. So if you're like recalling a memory and reminiscing about it, there is a projection of information from this area right behind your hippocampus to your visual cortex, which is kind of simulating, it's like creating like a literal simulation of that memory. And so music will spontaneously connect these areas, meaning that you're more likely to get like spontaneous memory recall passing into your experience of like closed-eyed mental imagery under the influence of at least LSD. But that's the only thing that research has been done on so far. Very likely that applies to psilocybin as well. There are increases in feelings of wonder and awe measured with LSD. So that's a good way to sort of bump yourself out of an uncomfortable experience, play some very appealing music, perhaps something that is evident to you. And the experience of music is associated with reductions in depressed mood 7 days after the drug. So the more that you enjoy the music in this LSD experience, the more of a positive effect it has on your brain. So, you know, people like Jimi Hendrix are maybe onto something. Listen to things that are very meaningful to you and that will do a lot of the work for you in creating a good psychedelic experience. So a lot of that research comes from this paper, The Hidden Therapist, Evidence for a Central Role of Music in Psychedelic Therapy. And here they more or less argue that the experience with music and the corresponding mental imagery that gets stimulated by this is enabling you to reach insightfulness and mystical experiences being associated with positive outcomes from psychedelic therapy treatment. So a good way to sort of get yourself to that place which is associated with well-being is to listen to beautiful music. Yes?
I was wondering if music has any unique effects that you wouldn't see with any other type of stimuli, like visual arts or something.
Yeah. So especially like this, like the spontaneous connection between the parahippocampal area and the visual cortex, that would be something. Because if you're looking at visual art, that might generate memories about it, but that's coming in from a different modality, and your vision is kind of being occupied by the visual art, and so that might bias you away from having this connection form, because you're sort of occupying the part of your brain that is being connected to this place involved in generating simulations of memories.
You would think it would be more associated with temporal connections rather than visual or auditory.
So the parahippocampal area is in your temporal lobe. Yeah. So it's like basically starting stimulation in there, but it projects information to the visual cortex. That's a connection that already exists and occurs when you are simulating memories, episodic memories of like times that you've had in your life. It creates sort of like a very basic mental imagery simulation, because mental imagery also uses a lot of the same areas involved in actual perception. So that's why it sort of connects into that visual area. Mostly your higher level visual areas involved in like understanding scenes and identifying objects. Although that can create a connection all the way down the visual hierarchy to create things that like seem very real to you. But yeah, that seems to be unique with music so far. And so there are things in psychedelic therapy where they do use meaningful images. In Johns Hopkins, they always have a rose with an asparagus leaf beside it as like a grounding item within the context of therapy. And if people are having a troubled experience, they tell them to meditate on the rose. And there's different ways that visual stimulus can translate into your experience. There's a story in William Richard's book called Sacred Knowledge, which is about mystical experiences in psychedelics. And he reports that an addict, when looking on the rose and thinking about relapsing, saw the rose wither and die. But when he thought about being abstinent and sober, saw the rose becoming full and growing. So yeah, the visual modality responds differently in a kind of associational way, but it seems that this is like a unique effect of music.
Would you say that the effect of music is because it's closer to like language, because it's processed by the same areas of the brain that language is, and therefore like it instills concepts and that kind of thing more readily?
I think there might be something to that, actually. Because, yeah, like, it seems maybe it's like sort of by proximity stimulating that area involved in like generating concepts of like memories, experiences that you've had.
Or music is like abstract language, kind of, right? Like it tells a story, sort of, and
yeah, in more of an emotional tone.
yeah.
And also, in general, music creates uniquely a lot of whole brain integration of activity. So even just like in a normal waking state, if you're listening to music, you're having much more of your brain being connected to make sense of the experience than you are for other kinds of experiences, which might have something to do with it as well. Okay, so moving on. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about personality, psychology, and the long-term effects, and then we'll give you some implications about this, and we'll finish up. So it's found that cognitive flexibility, or loosening of cognition, and optimism can remain up to 2 weeks. They're increased up to 2 weeks after the main acute drug effects have dissipated. So cognitive flexibility, referring to that capacity of your brain to break out of certain networks and to be able to explore which networks are more optimal for the problems that you're facing in everyday life, as opposed to being constrained to your resting state default mode networks. Cognitive flexibility is related to that capacity to be able to adaptively move outside of the default mode network and to visit other spaces in the brain that are more well suited to creatively solving basically every cognitive problem. There's different areas for all of them. Furthermore, long-term increases in creative problem-solving ability are increased, and as well as the personality trait of openness. And the personality trait of openness is related to the capacity for creativity. People who are high in openness are generally more creative. So the psychedelics are providing access to this cognitive capacity related to this fact of personality, which is related to intelligence and creativity. as well as the capacity for insightful problem solving and flexible thinking. And a study of regular, meaning weekly ayahuasca users showed improved cognitive functioning and visual processing and increased positive personality traits compared with matched controls, which is really interesting because whenever I talk to people about psychedelics, they're often worried about like hallucinatory persistence perception disorder, where just all of the time you're seeing things in the environment. And they're like, wouldn't that be disturbing? And does that happen? This study seems to show that it actually improves your vision in general. So, yeah, that is interesting. And it increases feelings of connectedness, as we talked about, connectedness to nature, connectedness to your social networks. And interestingly, this study here was done with psilocybin. It can increase your nature-relatedness and decrease your tendency to promote authoritarian political views as measured in patients with depression 7 to 12 months after being treated. So there are self-reports of positive long-term benefits. So in studies taken via internet surveys, there's a statistical link between reductions in psychological distress and suicidality, and just overall lower occurrences of mental health problems in general and the use of psychedelic compounds. And it's also been found that there's an increase in the personality domain of openness. As we talked about, so I'll break that down a little bit for you now. These are the big 5 personality traits. Neuroticism, which breaks down into volatility and withdrawal, so your tendency to respond adversely to things that aren't going away in the environment, and withdrawing from things that are discomforting. Agreeableness is related to compassion and politeness. Conscientiousness is industriousness, so your motivation to do work, as well as orderliness, the amount that you're structured in your thinking and in your behavior. Extroversion is related to enthusiasm and assertiveness. And openness, which is also just called openness/intellect, breaks down into openness and intellect. And there's a whole bunch of other subcategories in these. One of particular interest is the category of absorption and suggestibility, which is related to openness. And so what that means is absorption is as it implies, just being absorbed in something. So your tendency to get carried away in a musical experience, to get lost in yourself while watching media, that is related to this capacity for openness, to sort of get beyond yourself and immerse in some experience in the world. Suggestibility is very specifically defined as the tendency that you have to be able to produce mental imagery at other people's suggestions. So that's also related to your tendency to be hypnotized. So for example, in an experimental context, if somebody's imagine a lake, you could really easily do that at somebody's suggestion if you're high in openness, but not if you're low in openness. And so some personality predictors for different psychedelic experience. This one's related to that suggestibility absorption subtrait of openness. Conscientiousness predicts the magnitude of increase in suggestibility and absorption from LSD. So in everybody, you have an increase in absorption and an increase in suggestibility with LSD, but for people with that are high in the personality trait of conscientiousness, that is markedly more increased. And so the authors, what they speculate about that is that the trait of conscientiousness is related to different cognitive capacities involved in ordering your experience. It's top-down manipulation of the structures of experience, and so your cognition is very ordered and very logical, but there isn't as readily available to you the capacity to break out of those systems of order. So it's much more difficult if you're high in conscientiousness and someone says, imagine X. That is more difficult for you. And in the next week's lecture, there's an interesting implication about that for practicing the faculty of mental imagery to prepare for psychedelic experiences. That we'll talk about, so this will become more clear why this is significant. But yeah, it seems that psychedelics are interacting with things that are very fundamental to personality and temperament itself, where it can temporarily modulate aspects of your personality within the experience, but also to create permanent changes in specifically openness, which is related to creativity and flexibility, even months after a psychedelic experience. And whenever I say that, a lot of people are like, well, if you're too open, isn't that bad? My response to that is, there's like an upper limit. Like, you can't be open beyond a specific level. So you can't just become completely open to everything all the time. It's just not possible. There are constraints in your mind which prevent that from happening. So there's like an upper bound where you'll kind of max out on openness. In the package that I sent out everyone, there are some links to personality tests you can take to find out where you are on that. I'm at 100% openness. So I can't any more further. And yeah, do you still have a question? Oh, okay, I thought I said that. And yeah, so another important consequence for personality psychology is that neuroticism seems to be contributing to the strength of challenging experiences with psychedelics in uncontrolled settings. So if you take a personality test and you're really high in neuroticism, you should definitely find out if you're really high in neuroticism. Because if you don't have very specific controls on where you're doing these compounds, your bad trip will be really, really bad. It will be much worse than anybody else's trip who isn't high in that personality trait. Because neuroticism specifically is related to like how sensitive you are to uncomfortable experiences and uncomfortable stimulus. So this is incredibly important to be mindful of. Do a personality test to find out if you're high in neuroticism. You can probably intuitively tell if you are or aren't. And if you are, just take extra care about having supportive people that you really trust around and making sure you're in a safe and comfortable place so that you're not as likely to have adverse experiences cascade into being locked in a time warp for all of time and trying to fend off time beings that are trying to possess your mind or something like that. Okay, so summary of all of this. Psychedelics do the following. They dissolve the integrity of higher order functional connectivity networks that normally constrain your experience. It dysregulates the normal activity ordered in the brain by those networks. There is an increase in overall functional connectivity. There's a wider range of possible connections available to contribute to your experience. There are reductions in overall blood flow to the brain. It brings the brain closer to a high entropy or high disordered state, similar to that of REM sleep, dreaming, psychosis, creative thinking. It selectively increases blood flow and activity to the right frontal and temporal lobe. It increases resting state activity in the early visual processing areas, which results in those fall constants. Music profoundly impacts neural connectivity and the efficacy of the psychedelic experience. And this all happens primarily as a result of 5-HT2A receptor agonism, which just means it upregulates and makes those receptors and those neurons that are on more excitable and sensitive to fire. And so from this section, what are the consequences for trip preparation? Well, firstly, take a personality test. Find out where you lie on those dimensions. If you're high in neuroticism, make sure you take extra care to specify the space that you're in. If you're high in conscientiousness, there's like different things that you can do to prepare to make the experience more effective that we'll talk about next week with the discussion of mental imagery practices. Item 2 being use mental imagery practices because psychedelics expand your capacity to generate mental imagery and to increase its clarity. We'll really dig into that next week when we talk about the visionary mystical experience. Curate playlists that have highly personal and meaningful content. Can be often beneficial to use instrumental songs because of the increase in suggestibility that is a function of psychedelic use. Your experience might be susceptible to suggestion and lyrical content. That's why instrumental music might be better for allowing your own personal experience to unfold. Place meaningful symbols and objects in your environment. As mentioned, you become very sensitive to contextual factors because of those facts of increasing the strength of functional connectivity networks as well as the energy of them. Again, to just reiterate that, the energy of a functional connectivity network is how much of an effect that has on subsequent processing. So with like the normal waking state, these are just abstract numbers to give you an idea of the idea rather than being like literal from the brain research, because we couldn't really measure things this refined. But say I'll use again the example of like looking at a picture of my mom. If I'm just in a normal waking state, I look at a picture of my mom, it may stimulate 5 functional connectivity networks that are involved in recognizing the face, recalling memories of the time that that was taken at, and perhaps feeling a certain emotion about it. But in the psychedelic state, the energy is increased, meaning there is more of a cascade of activity that happens for meaningful stimulus, meaning that you might get like 10 or 15 functional connectivity networks that might involve this stimulation of a bunch of different memories, the incorporation of that stimulus into mental imagery, and different synesthetic experiences. So you're very sensitive to having very creative experiences, and you're more sensitive to stimulus creating abstract and more, what's a good way to put it? Yeah, it stimulates more activity, meaning that you'll have like more creative sorts of experiences. So put lots of meaningful things in your environment. You might, after having your eyes closed for a little bit, like look over and just see the right thing at the right time to spontaneously stimulate you into an insight. Because that's kind of the function of that. If you make your environment as meaningful as possible, you'll have a greater disposition towards having insights. And have a trusted sitter, of course, because if you do get feelings of losing control and paranoia, if you have any reason to doubt the motives of the person you're with, you will just have a very bad time. So yeah, that's that. And did you have a question? Okay. So yeah, that is the end of this presentation. If you have questions now.
I guess it depends on the purpose of the trip, but would you say self-coaching, setting an intention before the trip is a good idea? Like saying, I might have a bad trip and that's okay, type of thing.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit more about challenging experiences next week, and it is definitely okay if you have a bad experience, because those are opportunities for growth. And in the research, the experiences of like negative emotions, fear, and that kind of thing have absolutely no effect on how positive the experience is for you. And sometimes, like, you need to uncover very uncomfortable things about yourself. And I was just talking to somebody yesterday who has experienced like a lot of like sexual abuse and has had to relive a lot of those experiences on ayahuasca, and has also gotten very uncomfortable images of like people being lynched and like having their heads severed and that kind of thing. So that's why I mentioned in the use of the term entheogen, we should also be acknowledging the demonic aspects of these kinds of experiences. That which appears bad for you isn't necessarily bad for you. So accepting the possibility of uncomfortable experiences is very important. Setting intentions, yes, definitely important as well, because that will really ground the symbolic connections that you're making as the experience unfolds. If you're like, this is the sort of thing that I want to consider about myself, and you keep going back to that, you'll keep sort of threading the meaning and experiences that you have through that initial intention. And it's good to like have that grounding point so that you can really effectively deal with one or another problem. Yeah. Anything else?
Do you need a sitter if you're experienced of doing this? Is that always a...
No. No, it's good to do that at least the first time, just to be safe in case you don't know how you respond. I trip alone all of the time, and nothing bad has ever happened. It's also a very different kind of space if you're with yourself, because you don't have the social factor of somebody else's cognition through which you're filtering your experience. So it really allows you to get more into the depths of yourself. So if you feel comfortable doing it, I would highly recommend being on your own.
And are there advantages to organize the experience by writing things down or do you think it's just fine to, because you forget most of the stuff, right?
You mean like in the context of the experience itself?
Yeah.
It can be very difficult to write. So it might be good to leave yourself little notes, because you might forget it and come back to it and be like, oh yeah! And that can positively contribute to your experience. But as I said, there's as many psychedelic experiences as there are people. So if that's something that you want to do to like contribute to that like symbolic grounding of that intention that you set, to write out different insights about that intention as you go, that can be a very effective way of like increasing the coherence of your experience.
Yeah. At different doses, will you be able to have different sorts of insights, and at different levels of it, you can microdose and set an intention with a larger dose where you're basically incoherent about
Yeah, there's definitely different purposes to those things. So like microdosing is especially good if you're perhaps trying to get off of SSRIs or something like that. So I know somebody who was trying to get off of SSRIs, and sometimes you get like dizziness and like weird perceptual distortions where like if you like look to one direction, there will be like a lag in your vision. And after microdosing, it just cleared that up. Yeah. So also like, I mentioned briefly psychoanalytic therapy where you're using smaller doses and actually talking through content. So microdosing would be like good for that if you're like having like a deep conversation with somebody and you want to just like stimulate your capacity for creative insights, but still maintain your linguistic functions. But it's like good for having that conversation. One of the best things that I think about larger doses is the capacity for dream-like mental imagery. And we'll talk really about why that's useful next time. But just real quickly, any sort of experience at all, even mental imagery, which your brain can't always distinguish from actual experience, modulates the neurons involved in generating that experience, which is why like using mental imagery can be really effective in changing how you're making sense of things. And for trauma and anxiety, social anxiety, the imagery component of cognitive behavioral therapy is the most effective at treating those things because they are kind of imagery-related disorders.
So you mentioned there was a lot of similarity in effects with LSD and psilocybin. Would there be, like, how would you recommend like, choosing which one to do, depending on, I guess, the intention of the experience?
So there's two important differences. One of them is that psilocybin will more readily give you experiences of ego dissolution. So if you want to get that feeling of connectedness to nature and oneness with the community and the unit of mystical experience, psilocybin much more readily produces that. Whereas there is less of a likelihood for complete ego disintegration with LSD, so that allows you to be a little bit more in control of your experience. It also relatively more increases your resting state visual cortex activity and the capacity to generate vivid mental imagery. So the difference really is in how much direction do you want to have over the experience and how much, or what kind of experience you want to go for. Do you want the unitive feelings of connection, or do you want the vivid mental imagery that allows you to sort of interact with internal characters of your psyche?
I would say to expand on that just a little bit, for me, mushrooms are much more emotional, and acid is much more like cognitive. Yeah, and for me to begin with, when I first started taking psychedelics, mushrooms were easier for me. I enjoyed mushrooms more, I think because they were emotional. So you kind of get more out of it. But then as I sort of gained a little bit more experience with acid, I found that acid is preferable to me because you have more control over it. Yeah.
What about the physical conditions prepping for the trip? Like if you're on antidepressants, for instance, is it a good idea? Or if you like consume alcohol the night before, or like sleeping well, or all that?
So I included like a list of possible interactions in that downloadable package that I sent out. So did you like buy a ticket?
Sorry, I didn't. I guess read that page.
Cool. Yeah. So check that out. That'll give you like specific medications and the effect. Usually for like SSRIs, it just reduces the intensity of the experience because it's like interacting with and kind of like interfering with your serotonin system. So it'll make it less extreme. Do not, if you're using MAOI inhibitors, which nobody really does anymore anyways, but if you're taking an MAOI inhibitor, do not take psychedelics because you run the risk of serotonin syndrome if that's the case, which can kill you. What else? Antipsychotics, I wouldn't recommend taking psychedelics on, just out of the interest of toxicity. The antipsychotic category of medication usually have like high toxicity, and the reaction is really unknown, but I wouldn't chance it. So antipsychotics I would go off of. Serotonin's medication is not really necessary, but it might actually even be good if you like have like really extreme depression and you do medication to be on it when you're first doing psychedelics because it wouldn't be as overwhelming for you. But there's like a whole other.
Will the effect be still there?
It'll still be there. It'll just be really suppressed, so you'd have to take.
What I mean is, will you, like if you're a depressed person and you're on antidepressants and you take psychedelics, will the depression diminish over time if you take a large dose? Or will the antidepressant just put a stop to that?
Yeah, so there's no actual reason. research about that, but my intuition is that it would also blunt the positive effects. Specifically,
Oh, it will blunt it. Okay.
yeah. SSRIs usually interact on the 5-HT1 system, which if we refer back to that study like on the rats with social isolation, the 5-HT1 receptor system is completely intact, but there's a reduction in the amount of like 5-HT2 neurons, which are involved in like adaptive plasticity mediating change on your neurons. The 5-HT1 receptor system sort of keeps you glued to the world, and they are involved in like mediating your attention to the outside world. And so SSRIs interact mostly with the 5-HT1 system, which actually I have a good image that I can look up to show you from a psychedelic research paper. I must have put it in my Google Drive. I wouldn't address that specifically, but basically, the psychedelics will like increase your capacity to like change your neurons and experience a wider array of emotions. Whereas, so it decreases depression, whereas 5-HT1 receptor stimulation just kind of like increases your resiliency by blunting the experience of your emotions. And so the function of them usually is supposed to just be that you take them for long enough that you can become functional. And then you're supposed to really be taken off of them, because they do actually blunt your access to like emotional processing. And I've had this experience as well. I was put on SSRIs really young, and I realized it just made me think and feel nothing at all. And I think that it actually really impaired my capacity for my like natural healing mechanisms to actually work.
So maybe if you were on SSRIs and you took the psychedelic and your trip was not that great, it was blunted, but then you slowly got off the SSRIs because it somewhat helped you,
Yep.
and then your next experience, that may be the punch you needed, right?
Right,
to
for
sort
sure.
of like really help you to get rid of your depression?
Yeah,
possibly?
I think that would be a good way of looking at it for sure. And like if you're doing psychedelics while on SSRIs the first time, that might just be able to like get you into that space without being too anxious about it.
Right.
So like another like good step is to like don't dive into it completely. Like Terrence McKenna, as much as people love him, it's a terrible advice sometimes. He's like, yeah, just like do 5 grams in darkness and their first time and you'll be fine. You gotta jump into it. Like do not do that. Like warm your brain up to that space. Yes, you've had your hand for a while.
I was just wondering, for the SSRIs, is there any literature on the rates of effectiveness compared to psilocybin?
There is, yeah. This is included in a paper that Robin Carhart-Harris wrote with someone else. And they basically really don't treat depression at all. Like, they just make your experience manageable while you're on them, but they do not treat it. And so the distinction is between like palliative and curative medicine. Palliative medicine just treats symptoms, whereas curative medication actually like attacks the underlying cause of the condition. There's also like SNRIs, for example, which work on like norepinephrine, and so not everyone responds to the serotonergic theory of depression, and they actually need different receptor stimulation for mediating palliatively, and it should be temporarily the symptoms of those disorders. So yeah, it doesn't cure depression really at all, it just makes it more manageable.
Rock, paper, scissors. I'm going to be quick. First of all, one of my favorite Terrence McKenna quotes, and probably bad advice, take it easy, man, but take it. And then another, I think, important distinction between LSD and mushroom for somebody who's considering taking it for the first time is acid is a time frame commitment. Like you are high for 12 hours. If you're taking it late at night, by the time you're starting to come down off of it, it's gone. You're feeling very tired. You don't have the cognitive capability to like control your thoughts as much because you're exhausted from it. And so I find that if I've ever had a bad experience with LSD, it's because I'm tired. And the experience has just gone on for too long. Whereas mushrooms, like, can be emotionally more intense and stuff, but it doesn't last as long. It'll last like 4 to 6 hours.
Yeah. Acid can last like 12 hours if you take a lot of it.
Yeah, exactly,
Like
exactly. And you really can't like sleep on it or like escape for me anyways, so it's, if you take it late at night, just expect to be up until like the time you take it, like the AM, Yeah.
That's a good point.
Why is it so dire?
Sorry?
Why is it so dire to go through that experience?
Well, you're just, for one, awake for a long time. I think that what he's indicating as well is that like if you take it like 6 p.m., I mean, you're just naturally going to be tired by like the time 5
Yeah, exactly, but you're still
When you take psilocybin, at least for me, it's very dire.
Yeah, so I think
It's in a different way though. It makes you feel physically like yawny and stuff, but like you still have the cognitive resources to handle what's coming at you in terms of the experience. Whereas acid, like, it's just by, not as an effect of the drug, but because you're actually exhausted, you lose that cognitive resource capability.
I think another reason is that it's pushing the activity of your brain up into stuff that's usually used very infrequently for like top-down control. Whereas a lot of your processing is like automatic response from like learned network interaction. So yeah, it has to do like more novel figuring out of how to do things, and it's also shifting your processing up into like higher order cortical stuff, which requires a little bit more effortful control, even if it doesn't feel like it. The lower order stuff is mostly like automatic disposition, so it requires less sort of metabolic effort.
So I'm wondering, do you think that you need, or someone needs the entire psychedelic experience to benefit from it, or do you think if at some point we are able to isolate a specific portion of the experience, like let's say someone wants to solve a problem, and with LSD usually there's that first association from your environment where you kind of don't judge, you're just kind of observing, and that lets you be more objective. So let's say you were to just isolate a certain part of the experience.
It's called DMT.
Is it?
I would say it's called every religious and spiritual tradition in the world. Yeah. So for example, I'm going to include this as a reading for the next package that I send out. There's a guy named Dan Ripper who wrote a book on mystical experiences, and in the chapter on mystical experiences, he talks about like the 12 genres of Buddhism, which are like different experiences of nothingness. And so you sort of like gradually pull away different elements of your cognition. So you first like eliminate rational discursive thinking, and then you get rid of like you're thinking about time, and then you're just only aware of space, and then you get rid of that, and you're just aware of awareness itself. So that could be like something like that sort of like distancing effect that you're getting, which you could do gradually through meditative practices. And then things like the visionary experience where you're having like meaningful mental imagery that is positively changing how you're thinking, you can lucid dream. Yeah, because like the psychedelic state is basically the inverse of a lucid dream. They're using a lot of the same sorts of machinery to be effective.
So I have friends that they'll have a bad trip or whatever psychedelic it is, and then they'll take either like Xanax or any other GABA antagonist or agonist to like relax them or relieve anxiety, whatever. And they say that they feel less high. So do you know anything about that? Like, is that like an actual thing, or is it like some sort of illusion that they have?
No, a little bit. There's not too much research on that, but it's thought that the reason that the upregulation of your 5-HT2A receptors is in part effective is because it has downstream effects on your GABA system. So there's just like, we kind of know that that might be the case, that it might indirectly be affecting that particular neurotransmitter session. So that, yeah, could be an actual neurochemical thing happening.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
It's escaping me a little bit right now, trying to grab it. You were talking earlier about how like alpha and beta states and whatnot get kind of altered and get kind of kicks to one another, especially in different psychedelic states. Are you aware of anything in research or whatnot that talks about what kind of effects are related to the different states? Because I know like through meditation and whatnot, you can kind of bring your mind to different states and maybe consciously try to have certain experience to live with it.
Yeah, so a lot of that stuff is done with EEG, which I don't know too much about because the research that I read usually uses like fMRI as a means of measurement. And yeah, there's like really specific things about all the frequency bands. But my intuition, what I definitely know is that the alpha frequency band, which is usually active when you have your eyes closed and you're not doing anything. It's like what they use to determine if like the EEG system, which is like a bunch of electrodes in the brain, is actually measuring things correctly. Because usually anyone who just closes their eyes and sits there will have like alpha wave activity on the visual cortex, and I'm not exactly sure 100% what that does, but I do know that like LSD just gets rid of that. I have an intuition because I know that like the theta band is involved in like meditative and dream states, so it would likely also create a disposition to promoting that frequency band. And the frequency bands abstractly are just how many times a neuron is firing within a particular span of time. So I think, what is it? I think like alpha is like very quick and short bursts, whereas like the theta and gamma are like very slow and more drawn out frequencies. So yeah, that's like the sum of my knowledge of that.
Hey, you mentioned earlier about like planning out like if you're going to do something that's like spontaneous, or you have like directed points in the future that you plan when you're going into an experience. Can you share what like some examples of that would be? Like what would you determine? Like yeah, like when I'm 6 hours into this experience, like I want to do this kind of thing.
So I think what I was mentioning more so was being like on Saturday I'm going to do psychedelics as opposed to back to Friday. I mean you could do that as well, but my preference usually is to allow sort of what spontaneously emerges to emerge. Because then you're more sort of like listening to the experiences that are coming from your body and letting your body kind of drive the experience. So I think it's like, yeah, important to like plan ahead in the sense of like planning a specific day that you want to trip on. And then the experience of like setting your intention for like say weeks in advance can really be helpful because you're basically concentrating a lot of like intentional energy into what you want to be considering. And I had this one experience where I prepared like a month in advance for a trip that I was hoping was going to be really meaningful. I was using psilocybin, and I had this experience where like all of time collapsed, and I felt my psyche extending all the way across into the first instance of my setting the intention to do that. And it was like my mind was extended across an entire space of intention setting. So that's like an example of like how that can be interesting and very meaningful, right? Because there was like a lot of like significance that I've been putting into that over time. And it sort of all just like smashed into my mind at that one time. And that was like the time that I had like a mystical experience where I was like possessed with overwhelming love from above, and I just like literally couldn't stand. My whole body was just like emanating radiant compassion after that. It was pretty good. So, yeah, that can be very useful.
So you do recommend planning?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the spontaneous thing can be bad, especially if it's like, you know, someone's like, hey, it's like 11 p.m., we're at a rave, you want to do dancing for the first time? And then you're like, oh my god, it turns out that I was like beaten as a child and now I'm having hallucinations of like things chasing me in the forest and there's no one around who wants to talk to me about it. You know, the spontaneous thing can go bad. I mean, sometimes you can trust yourself. I'm not going to say never be spontaneous about it. Sometimes gifts are given to you at the right time. I don't know how spiritual you want to get with the analysis, but like, you know, synchronicities maybe sometimes happen and you needed that at that time.
But you go with your gut.
Yeah.
At that point, anyway.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, a lot of people just cannot trust their intuitions. So make sure that you can trust your gut, and then yes, trust your gut.
Like even leading up to a point, I've had a bad day before or the day of, and like you know, you plan a month ahead, and then I just had a bad time. So I'll try to plan and try to make sure it's a good day because you never know what can happen the day before or the day of. And
that's good too. Like, don't be too strict about the structures that you set for yourself. Sometimes it just becomes apparent that you shouldn't do it. You need to be able to flexibly make that decision. But I think an important thing to note as well is that, you know, when people talk about set and setting, set being like the psychological state that you're in, setting being the environment that you're in, often people are like, well, then I guess if I'm like depressed or in a bad mood, I should just not do psychedelics ever. And if that were reasonable, then psychedelics would not treat depression and they wouldn't treat trauma. So sometimes in order to intervene in a state of depression, that's exactly what you need. But yeah, there's like different markers that you can tell if you're like just really having a bad time, you know it wouldn't go good. But yeah, I do just like to clarify that sometimes like if you are depressed, that's exactly what you need to break you out of that.
In a certain way though, like if you're depressed and you want to work on yourself, like do it lying on a couch with music not at the music festival.
Yes,
or whatever.
yes, exactly. They're two very different experiences,
Yeah.
right? You get the sensitivity to context showing up. So yeah, the kind of thing that'll be useful for depression usually is like an internal experience where you're going to specifically come into contact with the reasons for your depression.
Yeah. One is sort of like positive psychology, and one is sort of like actually working on a problem, right? Like one's sort of like, to me, having a good time at a music festival or something with mushrooms is like preventative medicine, kind of.
Right, right.
Versus like actually trying to work on something.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable distinction, for sure. Yes?
Would you say that listening to, I don't know, somebody who's, let's say, what is for self-reflection on maybe a microdose or a small or a dose where you can still understand what's going on for increased insight and sort of self-transformation based on what you're listening to?
Yeah, I think that would be a good thing to do, because it'll make you more receptive to things from the world. So you'd be more readily able to integrate that kind of thing. I mean, I'm not saying that I do this, but like maybe sometimes if you're talking to your professors about something meaningful, microdosing in that conversation might be okay. Yes?
So I know this is kind of, there's a lot of factors in this question, but what psychedelic do you think would generally shut down the default mode network generally?
Psilocybin has been shown to do that more reliably. And I think DMT just annihilates all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to say, because there's not as many, like...
Or it wouldn't matter at all? It just does that?
No, I think, yeah, breakthrough. It's in proportion to the dose, right? So it's like if you take enough LSD, it's going to happen inevitably. If you take enough mushrooms, it's going to happen inevitably. The mushrooms seem to have more of a disposition towards dissolving that, creating those feelings of unity that comes from dissolving that self-sense-making thing into your world sense-making things.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yes.
There was some research on like traumatic brain injury and I think psilocybin at least, but just in terms of it promotes, at least in the hippocampus, neural regeneration. Right?
Yeah, that study was done in mice or rats, I think.
I think it was actually done. I think that's the case, and I think they also did that on some stem cells and neural stem cells.
Okay, cool.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, plasticity has happened like all of the time. It used to be thought that like your connections kind of get really stable after a while, but neurogenesis is like possible at all points in life. It does seem that psilocybin could upregulate that, and I think that something that is perhaps more effective than just the fact of growing new cells is growing new connections. So it might be useful in traumatic brain injury in two ways. Because of the vasoconstrictive effect, like mild doses of psychedelics, like do not do this because I'm just like making this up based on what I read on like WebMD and stuff. But a friend of mine was like, I have a concussion, should I do psychedelics? And so I was like, did a bit of research into that. Because it's like vasoconstrictive and concussions are a result of like an increase in blood flow to a particular kind of area, you might reduce the negative effect of concussions by creating like less pressure on that neural area, and so less damage over time. And because it promotes the wiring of neural networks, you could be able to learn novel pathways to process the kinds of information that the brain injury is getting in the way of. Like I mentioned, that ferret experiment where they made them see with their temporal lobes and hear with their visual cortex, some sort of minimal case could happen where like the neurons are sort of growing around the traumatized area to adaptively relearn how to process the impaired area.
So there seems to be other options for patients with depression, like transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Yes.
It seems to do a similar job as a psychedelic drug, but it seems to be much more controlled because they put it on a spot and do it. So why would a patient opt to do psychedelics versus doing TMS?
Because it's wonderful.
Honestly, TMS, we don't know how safe it is. I mean, like, you fill a stack of consent forms if you're ever participating in one of those. So
You probably fill the same stack you're taking.
much safer. I mean, they're pretty. I'm pretty sure they're safe.
Psychedelics are just not some medications that you can take. They're just genuinely pretty good for you. And we don't have any longitudinal studies on TMS or TCDS, because you could also use like magnetic waves to sort of like knock out different brain areas and alter area processing. I would say that we do know that TCDS can alleviate impairments such as depression, and it can put you back to baseline. And I think that psychedelics might have the advantage of like being more holistic in reorganizing the entirety of your psyche towards well-being, and then beyond that into like insightfulness and wisdom and that kind of thing. You can do similar things with TCDS, but interestingly, often by stimulating the same sorts of things that like psychedelics are stimulating anyways. And I think that there's benefits to, we'll talk a bit about this next week. You can, for example, revisit characters that come to you in a psychedelic experience, and you can revisit places that sort of creates an internal mythology that as it increases in coherency, your character also increases in coherency, and you'll get more out of your experiences as you build this sort of like internal mythology of experience.
So you think the benefit comes from how participatory the
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good term for it, because there's different kinds of knowing as well. There's propositional knowing, there's like knowing how to act, there's like participatory knowing, and so yeah, definitely it allows you to participate in experiences, and there's like unique things that come from participating in an experience itself, as opposed to just like targeting the lower order neurons.
Right, and it feels much more endogenous in terms of the, as opposed to somebody else manipulating behaviors for you. It feels much more endogenous.
Yes, there's like more autonomy in it,
Yeah.
you could say.
That's something I find with psychedelics especially, is they don't necessarily force you to feel good or force you into a certain place in your mind. Like you feel like you really kind of worked to get there. And so that gives so much like more to the experience. It makes it more genuine than like something like, I mean, not to put MDMA down, but MDMA just kind of makes you feel good. So I find that the experiences and the insights that I get from that are colored a little bit differently because I don't feel like I worked as hard to get there.
Yeah, the other psychedelics are more general purpose. It's a state, an initial condition, from which you can do a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah.
So,
Would you say there's any things that you need to do to stabilize, like let's say you're depressed, you take a psychedelic, you have insights, and you have positive changes in the mood, and this is for, let's say, a month, 6 months, but do you need to do things to stabilize new patterns of behavior that prevent falling back into depression or things like that?
yep, definitely. So in the treatment-resistant depression studies, they found that self-connectedness, so like being connected to your experiences and hobbies and interests across your life, is related to and mediates connectedness to others and the environment. So integration is very important, making sure that if you're like, oh, you know what, like I forgot that I really like this thing that's very meaningful to me, don't just like have that insight, but like incorporate that into your life again. You know, structure yourself in accordance with the insights. You do have to like act on them. Also like journaling and writing about it can really help you thoroughly make sense of it. And even just like writing in general has been shown to be like very positive for facilitating personality change and self-knowledge. So writing after a psychedelic experience is also very important in integrating it into yourself, and that can mediate the positive effects.
So going off that, Jung had one concern about psychedelics is that they give you a greater sense of what was meaningful to you, but therefore also what personal responsibilities you had. And his fear was that if you did them repeatedly without acting on them, you'd be crushed by how much you were failing to live up to by the sense of that. I don't know if you had a...
Let me just think about that for a second.
You never did psychedelics.
You really have to let that accumulate.
Sorry?
You'd really have to let that accumulate for a long time to like start feeling that guilty about not acting on it, you know, and I think that eventually you just would like, you know, before it crushes you, you'd end up just integrating some of it.
Yeah, I don't really see that being too much of a fear. I mean, Jung's mind was just pretty psychedelic on its own. So like very specific to him. You know, he would just like randomly, like in the practice of active imagination, which I'll be sending some resources out. He would like get kind of like sleep paralysis experiences where he just like active imagination is just like kind of like mindful daydreaming. You know, you're just interacting with images that are spontaneously coming to you, and there's like a symbolic nature to those, and that can help you sort of like interact with simulations of experience that like through archetypal imagery give you insights about yourself. Psychedelics really upregulate the capacity, but like Jung, for him, it was just like automatic and immediate. And there were even experiences where he'd like just sit back and close his eyes, and then he's like, oh, well, there's the devil, and now I can't move. What do I do? And he literally was like immobile. So there's like very specific things about him as an individual which could lead him to think that. But yeah, I mean, I've never had anybody report that kind of experience. And there's like a lot of the lower order stuff, like just breaking out of like certain networks that are constraining your thinking. You don't really even need to have like any particular insight in order for like practicing those ways that your network's interacting being good for you.
I just want to add to that is wanting to have a really intense experience is always, I would default to eye shades laying flat.
Yeah.
And so you tend to forget that when doing things, but default to eye shades laying flat. And I want to add vomiting and purging and dry heaves. And some people don't know about that. And sometimes that's regular for individuals.
Right.
And that's just a normal part of the process. And just go with it. And sometimes dry heaves are wonderful. Just work through that, and it just takes you to another level and deeper, deeper, deeper. And then you'll just ride
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah, that's
And
very
it's-
good.
And it's very beautiful to go through that process.
Yeah, because it's like cognition is like really embodied, right? So like your embodied experience is like the foundation for all of your thinking. And so what you're kind of doing there is you're enacting a kind of concept. You're enacting the purging of like psychological toxins from your system. So that purging reaction is very common in people, especially who have alcohol use disorder. Very common that condition with like psilocybin and LSD, whereas it's not very common for other people. So depending on what sorts of concepts you're working through, you might need to like play out those embodied modes of experience and process them. Yeah. And about the eye shades thing, that is definitely good for certain people. I find that for me, a lot of my thinking is very embodied, so I find that like sort of like improvisational movement and dance is really effective for me processing things. So yeah, it's really about listening to your body as well. That's like a really good starting point, especially if you want to get like mental imagery content, which is very useful. But it's not like the only way to have a psychedelic experience.
I think the comment about young kind of made me think about something. I guess a concern I can see is, like, I guess taking psychedelics and then reaching like enhanced insight or wisdom, but not yet incorporating that meaningfully into your life and your social surroundings.
Yeah.
And then you keep kind of riding that wave, and then you kind of go back into your community, and you might start to isolate yourself because you'll get frustrated with the fact that you might like reach this insight and enlightenment, but like let's say your family and friends are not like having those insights, and you start to get frustrated, and you start to isolate yourself more. I can see that becoming like a
Definitely.
interesting possibility.
Oh yeah. Paradoxically, ego inflation is very possible with the use of psychedelics because you're like, well, I've perceived divine truth. I know how society needs to run. Why can't you lay people see this? So yeah, there's an academic who's an anthropologist here at U of T, and he talks a little bit about that. His name is Mark Blaney. And so he writes about like ayahuasca and Xanadu, and he's publishing a book pretty soon, which will also address that danger of ego inflation. Mark Blaney, so it's M-A-R-C. B-L-A-I-N-E-Y.
Danger of what?
Ego inflation.
It's ironic, eh? The pendulum just swings back kind of.
I know, yeah.
Yeah, totally.
It's very variable. And
I find ketamine to be a very ego-inflating substance. Yeah.
What about it specifically?
Just that, like you're like, oh man, I'm seeing things so clearly right now. Like even when you're on it, like it's kind of like paradoxical. Like you sort of lose your ego, but you sort of get this like, wow, I am so aware feeling too.
Right.
That, yeah, it's hard to describe, but
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like, oh man, I saw a hilarious meme, which was like, it was like a dog with crooked eyes, like sitting around a bunch of crystals, and it was like when your friend gives you ketamine at a festival one time, and now you're like purging fluoride from your calcium, from your pineal gland with crystals. So yeah, definitely.
I have one more question. I'm curious because I've experienced it myself. If maybe next week or whenever we'd be covering or talking about glossolalia at all.
Oh, we're not going to be talking about that specifically, but I can give you, actually, maybe I will talk about it because there's a very simple way in which I think it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll probably include it again next week, but roughly, so the right temporal lobe is involved in experiences of insight and mystical experience, and there's sort of like emergent electrical instability that sort of like gets passed up through the temporal lobe, and is usually downregulated by like your medial prefrontal cortex at the front. But in the occurrence, like people who have lesions in that medial prefrontal cortex area just have spontaneous mystical experiences like all the time. And so what I think glossolalia does is it creates electrical instability between the language processing center, which is like below your medial prefrontal cortex, and the language comprehension center, which is in your temporal lobes. And so they're trying to make sense of each other, but no sense is being made. And so there's like more instability in the connections as they're trying to spontaneously figure out what's happening. And so you create more of a disposition for that like emergent instability happening through your right temporal lobe to sort of scaffold you up into a mystical experience.
Why does it feel so good? Like when I experienced glossolalia only once on maybe like 6 grams of mushrooms, it was like orgasmic, like I was releasing something, and it was just like, you know, and it felt fantastic. Like it felt like I was really releasing something, getting rid of it. So there was a lot of emotion tied into it too. I guess I don't know. But that's sort of an external feedback.
It's an experience of ecstasy, which is a subcategory of the unity mystical experience. So it was just. What that was is a mystical experience, and the qualities of the mystical experience are overwhelming, rapturous joy and ecstasy.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll be covering that in depth next week.
You were tripping balls, right?
Glossolalia. 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 It's the spontaneous random generation of phonemes, kind of, is how I would define it.
That's how you spell it. And Pentecostal
Yeah, I was gonna say.
we use this as a method to generate mystical experiences.
Yeah.
Speaking in tongues.
One of the things you said for somebody with on antipsychotics is
It's like uncontrollable. You just go like, oh, what? Phonemes are the smallest units of language, right? So like, you're just randomly, spontaneously generating sequences and strings of phonemes tied together that have no meaning.
I don't know that would be
and they just spill out. You just can't control it.
And even if just out of like a lack of knowing and a lack of understanding of both the conditioning and the stuff going on in the psychedelic experience. Although, the last time I did this last year, there was somebody in the audience who was like, as somebody with schizophrenia, I want to mention that psilocybin makes my hallucinations make sense. Yeah, so we had at least that anecdotal report from somebody who was here, and I was like, maybe don't do that just because like we have no idea what would happen. And he was like, it's really good for me. It actually constrains and makes my hallucinations make sense and useful to me. I'm still gonna stick with like, maybe don't do that, but I mean, that's just because I would feel bad about being like, that's okay, and something terrible happening, and I just do not know enough to like comment meaningfully on that.
People who, I guess, are terminally ill, they seem to benefit from taking psychedelics. And I guess with studies with meditation and just general ways of improving well-being, it improves longevity. Do you think that psychedelics can inadvertently improve longevity?
In maybe a very roundabout way, because like there's a very prominent psychosomatic component to illness, where if you're under consistent stress, you're impairing your autoimmune system, and you're not going to be able to as effectively respond to an illness. So by alleviating conditions of anxiety and stress, that could sort of restore balance to like immune function in a very indirect way, and so could perhaps in that way increase slightly your longevity. It's kind of speculative, but no, it's possible.
The other part of that is when you relax, your regenerative processes actually sort of takes place. You have like two systems, right? The arousal and the rest. I'm forgetting the type.
Sympathetic versus parasympathetic.
Right. So when you're in a state of rest, it activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which is really important for your body to regenerate. So if you look at like meditators, like they look like sometimes 20 years younger than they are, because they're really relaxed all the time.
I think that meditating and psychedelics also sort of leads you to just live a healthier life.
Yeah.
Right?
That would be the goal. And it can, yeah. Minus those like minor issues about like ego inflation and that kind of stuff.
Speaking of the effect of instrumental music on your trip, I was wondering if you have any personal experience with highly rhythmic music versus like principally melodic music. Because when you think of like certain cultures or traditions, they use psychedelics to achieve some mystical experience or magical thinking. You also sort of imagine them doing this to a background of some highly rhythmic music.
Yeah.
And I also find that even when sober, rhythmic music has a different psychological effect than something that's like classical music.
Yeah, definitely. Like rhythm can itself be a method of inducing altered states of consciousness.
Brainwave entrainment.
Yeah, one of the reasons is brainwave entrainment. So actually, a cool consequence about that is if you can like actually
do it to slow, right? I think, or
I mean, depending on the rhythm, you would be able to like entrain to different like frequencies to get into different altered states of consciousness. And usually so there is a paper about different qualities of music and how that can lead up to psychedelic mystical experiences. And so the general abstract idea is that in the beginning phase, you want to use very coherent melodic music, and then as you get deeper into the experience, you need to use like more like chaotic, disorganized music, because that'll contribute to like more of an attempt to actively make sense of something that doesn't make sense, and then like really like rhythmic music to like sort of scaffold you into a mystical experience. So that's sort of like a general flow that in the research has been found is beneficial. You start like with high order, and then as the experience progresses, you slowly have a disintegration in the order of the music. And that's really conducive to facilitating mystical experiences. One of the things that rhythm does is, there's a term by a guy named Winkleman. He refers to neural axial integration, which is what happens when you're like drumming and chanting and like moving back and forth in like shamanic ritual consciousness induction. And you're basically entraining the entirety of your nervous system from your higher order cortex down like through your thalamus into your nervous system, and you're getting them to sort of all like work in concert together. And so like that could be what rhythmic music is doing, is it's creating that sort of like entrainment along your entire nervous system, bringing everything into sort of a very coherent state that you can then, through that music, drive in one or another direction.
What's that called again?
Neuroaxial integration. Yeah, it's a cool term. Anything else? I'm a little tired, so
See you next week.
wrap up pretty soon.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I forgot actually that I didn't introduce myself at the beginning of this. So I'm Dan, and yeah, I'm a student of cognitive science at U of T, and I'm still in my undergrad, but I'm hoping to work towards researching psychedelics. So that's why I'm doing this kind of thing. And thank all of you for coming. I appreciate your presence. I hope you found this useful, and I hope to see some of you again next week.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.